JP?
Yes po.
Okay ba yung audio ko? Malakas naman?
Yes po, malinaw po.
Okay, sige. Salamat. Lay, oo, sa FB page ng UP Diliman. Okay.
Ang dulce.
Lay?
Ang dulce, hindi ko po siya makita.
UP Diliman?
Hindi ko po siya makita sa Facebook page ng UP. Ito po, ngayon ang pulungas. Okay naman dulce.
Chancellor,
Dulce.
magsimula tayo ng 10-10. Okay lang ba yon?
10-10. Sige, sige.
Sige. Salamat. JP, marami pa bang pumapasok? JP, naririnig ako?
Yes, ma'am.
Oo, marami pa bang pumapasok?
Trickles po. Pero ngayon, nasa 230 attendees tayo sa Zoom.
Okay, sige. Chancellor, magsimula na ako?
Sige, sige.
Okay, sige. Okay na, JP, tayo.
Go ahead. Go ahead, ma'am.
Magandang umaga at welcome sa ating webinar, Ating Alamin, Mutations, Variants, Vaccines. What's new about COVID-19? Ang webinar na ito ay bahagi ng serye ng mga public health forums na isinasagawa ng UP Diliman COVID-19 Task Force. Noong Enero ay una nang tinalakay ang mass testing na inisyatiba ng UP Diliman. At dahil sa maraming tanong na lumabas sa forum na iyon, nakita ng task force na talagang naghahanap at nangangailangan ang ating komunidad ng impormasyon. Nakita rin na maganda kung maibabahagi natin ang mga impormasyon sa mas malawak na publiko. Kaya sa unang pagkakataon ay ila-livestream ang ating diskusyon sa FB page ng UP Diliman. At ngayong umaga, susubukan nating sagutin ang ilang tanong na lumabas nitong huling forum. Ano nga ba ang mutation? Ano ang ibig sabihin ng genetic variation? At ano ang implikasyon nito sa mga ilalabas na vaccines para sa COVID-19? Para magpaliwanag ng mga ito, inimbitahan natin si Dr. Edsel, miyembro ng UP COVID-19 Task Force at mula sa UP Philippine Genome Center. Pero bago magsalita si Doc Edsel, gusto nating tawagin ang Chancellor ng UP Diliman para magbigay ng pagbati o welcome remarks. Chancellor Fidel Nemenzo.
Naririnig niyo ako?
Naririnig kayo, Chancellor.
Ay, magandang umaga sa lahat. Mayong buntag sa tanan. Sa ngalan ng UP Diliman at ng UP Diliman COVID-19 Task Force, I welcome you to this morning's forum on COVID variants and vaccines. No? Alam naman siguro nyo na nung isa sa unang desisyon na ginawa ko bilang Chancellor ay ang pagbubuo ng ating UP Diliman COVID-19 Task Force, no? Para planuhin at i-implement ang tugon natin sa pandemya bilang isang academic community. No? Ang gusto natin ay ma-minimize ang negative impact ng pandemya sa ating komunidad at i-ensure yung sustainability at continuity ng ating delivery of mandate, no? Sa harap ng hamon na dulot ng pandemya. Lahat naman tayo binulagan ng pandemya, nagulat tayo, no? Wala tayong mga templates dito. Like the rest of the country, we had very little preparation at we had to learn along the way. No? Pero maaga pa lang, alam namin sa task force na ang ating tugon ay kailangang communities. Ang response natin may 4 na stages. No? Una, good health and safety. No? Kaya dito sa Diliman, binuksan natin ang Palma Hall at Molave. Tinawag natin itong Kanlungang Palma at Sulungang Molave. Binuksan natin sila as COVID isolation centers. Nagsagawa tayo ng past testing. Nagsagawa rin tayo ng flu vaccinations, etc. The second part of our strategy is ensuring and giving support to our academic and research functions. No? At marami dito ay pinangunahan ng OPCAA at OPCRD. These were our responses to the disruptions to the semester. Nagsagawa tayo ng maraming webinar tungkol sa ating shift sa remote learning. The third component of our strategies is equate and continuous flow of UPD services. We had to safeguard our workplaces. We had to come out with guidelines at various stages of the quarantine, guidelines for our workplaces. The fourth part, at ito napakahalaga, is effective communication.
So,
a key component of our response is awareness building. No? After all, we are a university community. This forum is part of our effort to arm our community with information, to help them clarify questions, to make sense of the many things happening, to help them read the news and discern what is valid news and fake news. No? Our information campaigns will help our community make decisions for their families, decisions for the workplace, decisions for themselves. No? And for the first time, gaya na nasabi ni Doc Dulce, we are opening our webinar to everyone as bilang bahagi ng public service ng UP Diliman. No? Ang ating speaker, si Marc Edsel Ayes, ay isa sa mga key doctor scientists of the Philippine Genome Center. Isa po siyang molecular biologist at physician by training at miyembro ng aming UP Diliman COVID-19 Task Force. Kaya nasasalamatan ko si Dr. Ayes or si Dr. Dulce Natividad at ang UP Diliman Task Force sa pag-organisa ng public service webinar na ito. Sige, maraming salamat sa inyong pagdalo. Gandang umaga.
Salamat, Chancellor Nemenzo. Bago tayo tumuloy, kung may mga tanong kayo o komento, pwede niyong isulat ito sa Q&A box o dun sa chat box natin. Makikita to sa ibaba ng Zoom. Para naman sa mga nanonood sa FB, pwede rin ninyong isulat yung mga comments ninyo doon sa thread sa FB. At sisikapin namin na i-monitor at bigyan ng sagot ang inyong mga tanong. So nabanggit na nga ni Chancellor Nemenzo na ang ating speaker sa ngayon ay si Dr. Marc Edsel. Siya ang Lab Manager and Clinical Health Specialist ng Genomics Laboratory ng UP Philippine Genome Center. Ang Philippine Genome Center ho ay matatagpuan sa Science Complex dito sa UP Diliman. So nung tinatanong ko si Doc Edsel kung anong klaseng doktor siya, geneticist ba siya o microbiologist ba siya, ang sagot nga niya sa akin ay tawagin na lamang siyang isang doctor scientist dahil siya ay physician by training, scientist in practice. At ang kanyang specialization ay virology and immunology. Mas maipapaliwanag pa niya ito habang siya ay nagsasalita sa kanyang presentation. Pero hiniling ko rin kay Doc Edsel na maganda siguro na simulan yung kanyang presentation na maipaliwanag kung ano ba ang papel ng UP Philippine Genome Center sa COVID response ng gobyerno. So, pakinggan natin si Dr. Edsel.
Yan, naka-on ba yung video ko? Kita ba ako? Ayan, okay. Sige, magandang umaga po. Nagpapasalamat ulit ako sa UP Diliman Task Force for asking me to share yung alam ko, yung knowledge ko dito sa subject na to. Aaminin ko, medyo komplikado po talaga ang subject na to. Pero susubukan po natin gawin siyang para maintindihan po ang lahat. Kasi this involves all of us, lalo na ngayon nasa konteksto po tayo ng isang pandemya. Bagamat isa po itong opportunity para magkakaroon ng bagong kaalaman po dito sa field ng virology at immunology na yun nga po, sa totoo lang, it's a very complex and yet evolving field of study. Now, actually wala po akong slides sa Philippine Genome Center, pero sa ngayon po, ang Philippine Genome Center po ay itinatag po noong 2007 po actually. 2009. Ang mandate ng pagbuo ng Genome Center ay sagot po sa naging hamon sa bansa nung unang paglabas ng SARS-CoV noong 2009, kung naalala niyo po yon. Yan po yung virus na nagkaroon ng epidemic doon po sa China at sa South Korea. Ng awan ng Diyos, hindi siya umabot ng tuluyan dito. Mga dalawa lamang po yung kaso dito noong 2009. But it was enough to push the government po na mag-isip na kailangan magpatayo ng isang center po na kaya po sumagot sa hamon na kung kailan may dumating na pandemya ay may sasagawa po yung genomic biosurveillance upang may baba at matugunan po yung mga challenges. And that's exactly what the Genome Center is doing now. Nung nagsimula yung pandemya, ang unang response po was to convert our laboratories into testing facilities. Kasi yung unang requirement, yung need ng bansa nung panahon yon is fast testing po. Nung nagsimula po kami noong April, halos 40 lang po ang mga laboratorio na kaya gumawa ng COVID-19 testing using the RT-PCR method, yung gold standard po. Sa ngayon po, we already have over 200 laboratories. Now, given we are moving sa phase ng pandemic na kung saan medyo bumababa na yung mga kaso at papasok na yung mga vaccine, ngayon lumilitaw na po yung mga issue gaya ng magiging bisa pa rin po ng vaccine kapag meron pong mga variant na lumalabas at nakikita sa balita. Yung variants na to, I will give more information. Anong ibig sabihin nito? Bago lang ba to o matagal na namin po nalaman? At bakit ngayon po lamang po nagiging issue po? Tapos, ngayon, ang ginagawa po ng Philippine Genome Center is we are spearheading the Biogenomics Biosurveillance Project kung saan po may mga samples na pinapadala around the country upang ma-whole genome sequencing namin. Kumbaga, titingnan namin po yung pinaka-sequence ng virus at masasabi po namin anong klaseng variant ito. Kung nabasa ninyo po sa balita, yung pag-identify po ng mga UK variants sa Cordillera region at mga iba pang regions ay from the work of our talented scientists dito po sa PGC. At as we speak, we are still continuing yung pag-sequence at pagbigay informasyon sa DOH Epidemiology Bureau upang it will help give us an idea of the extent of variants in the country and also any new evolving variants and strains. And I think that's a good springboard po dito sa topic ko ngayon about mutations, variants, and vaccines. Pero to begin, so start na tayo ha. Warning lang, para itong lecture sa mga estudyante ko sa genetics. So lahat kayo, mga estudyante ko ngayon sa genetics. Ayan, so aral-aral tayo lahat ha. So to begin, I just want to set the groundwork. No? Alamin natin ano yung DNA, RNA. Kasi ito talaga yung pinaka-tinututukan dito throughout the entire pandemic. Kapag nagte-testingan kami ng mga samples na pinapalado nyo sa amin o kahit anong laboratorio, ang pinag-uusapan po ay yung RNA, yung pinaka-blueprint, yung molecules that encode for everything in life. Be it human beings, animals, viruses, lahat po ng mga impormasyon ay naka-encode or naka-store sa tinatawag na DNA tsaka RNA. At may summarize po ang role ng mga molecules na to sa tinatawag na central dogma. Yung DNA, nagsisilbing parang template para gumawa ng RNA at from there gumagawa ng protein, which is the building blocks na nagbubuo sa mga organismo. Now, ang analogy that we usually give para mas madaling maintindihan ay para siyang yung DNA, para siyang cookbook. No? Lahat ng mga recipe na paggawa ng mga lutuin ay matatagpuan sa loob ng cookbook. Na kapag ikaw ay magluluto, kukuha kayo ng isang recipe doon sa loob, yan yung parang RNA nyo po. So, bale, pipilian nyo po ano yung lulutuin ninyo at nang niluto nyo, siya nang lalabas na protina. Yan na po yung pinakbet natin. So, that's the idea there. Parang nagluluto tayo. Now, we'll have to move around. Narinig mo yung mga terms. Ay, ano naman yung mutation, yung strain, yung variants na kung tawagin, no? Kaya ko inuna ko yung pag-define is because we need to understand saan po pumapasok yung mutation at anong implikasyon nito po. And dahil yung pinagsasabi natin yung DNA, no? Ang mutation po describes a genetic event. Ibig sabihin po may pagbago doon sa mismong sequence ng DNA. Oh. So, yung DNA, kung isipin nyo parang recipe siya, may mga letrang yan na may specific sequence yan. Kapag nagbago yung sequence na yan, tawag namin dyan mutation. Kung ibalik natin sa analohiya ng ng recipe, parang imbis na inuna mo yung pagsiga, inilagyan nyo muna ng ibang gamit. So you change the steps o baka mami naglagay ka ng konti mong special ingredient imbis na asin, dinagdagan mo ng bagoong. Those are mutations. Those are changes in the recipe that doesn't necessarily affect the overall dish. Nag-iiba lang siya. Now, mutation, actually, natural occurring yan. It can occur. It can occur as a result of an error. Nagkamali lang talaga habang nagluluto ka masyadong maalat, ididagdagan mo ng tubig. So there can be errors in how the DNA is replicated. Pero meron din mga ibang paraan po, and you might be aware with some of these. Yung isa, ionizing radiation. Kapag ikaw nakabilad sa araw, you're exposed to ultraviolet radiation. At kapag masyadong matagal, gaya ng mga magsasaka dun sa field, they are prone to developing skin cancers po. That's another example po of mutations that can occur from radiation. Yung mga iba, exposure to chemicals, mutagens. May mga specific chemicals that can cause certain cancers or mutations. And even in the laboratory, ginagawa namin yan para gumawa ng mga mutant variants. Maglalagay kami ng tinatawag na mutagens. At pwede rin po mga viral infections. Ang mga virus din po pwede magkaroon ng mutation kasi the way viruses mutate, hina-hijack nila yung pinaka-machinery ng cell ninyo at ginagamit nila yung machinery para mag-replicate sila. And that can cause some mutations and errors. An example po, kapag alam niyo yung HIV, which causes AIDS, merong mga tinatawag na AIDS-defining cancers, meaning mga cancer na natatagpuan lamang po sa mga taong na-infect ng HIV. Yung example nito is what we call Kaposi sarcoma that is caused by the HIV virus po. Now, like gaya ng sabi ko, kapag may mutation, ito ang nagka-characterize ng tinatawag natin variant or strain. Now, narinig ko may konting confusion to. Ano bang pinakaiba ng strains and variants? To make things simple po, they pretty much refer to the same thing. And there is no general consensus. Alam ko may mga iba doon po na nagsasabi na ang variant parang mas maliit, yung strain mas malaki. It actually depends on the virus that you're talking about at iba-iba. Kasi marami talagang medyo aaminin ko yung mga virologists kanya-kanya minsan. Kapag when you're studying one virus, ganito ang mga style nila ng pag-report ng virus. When you go to another virus, nag-iiba na yung style nila. So just to make things simpler, when you're talking in discourse, when you hear people say strains or variants in the context of COVID, halos magkapareho po ang pinag-uusapan natin para hindi tayo malito. Ha? So again, ganun nga. So parang when you talk about a mutation, gaya ng sabi ko, parang you're changing a bit of the recipe, pero yung lalabas pa rin, pinakbet. Alam mo, parang pinakbet pa na. Yung lasa ng pinakbet ng isang tao ay may konting pagkaiba doon sa isang tao, pero pinakbet pa rin siya. Sometimes the variants can be very obvious, very different, no? Like halimbawa yung dalawang to, kapag sanay kayo sa sinigang na medyo maasim-asim, punta ka naman doon sa may Pampanga, mahilig sila maglagay ng may bayabas. It's both sinigang, pero notably different. But going outside even, kasi alam ko mahilig tayo, baka nagugutom kayo sa mga analiya ko, no? Ang SARS-CoV din po, ang pinsan niya is the original SARS-CoV, no? The one that happened in 2009. Pareho silang magkapinsan, magkamukha sila, mga sabaw na luto, kaso they're very different. Kung yung mga SARS-CoV-2 na pinag-uusapan, mga sinigang at may iba't ibang versions of the sinigang, magkaiba talaga siya sa SARS-CoV kahit they're in the same family. Pareho silang sabaw, magkaiba yung dish. So that's the idea there. Pero let's talk about ba't nagkakaroon ng variation? But may mutation? Ano bang ibig sabihin nun? Now, a mutation is actually a form of evolution. It's about adaptability. Kapag may pressure sa labas, genetic pressure, nagkakaroon ng mutation upang mag-adapt. Kung yung isipin to, kapag ikaw ay nasubukan, syempre, susubukan mo rin din mag-adapt. No? Kapag alam mo may test o pagsusulit na darating, mag-aaral kayo para makapasa. Na minsan, yung mga mutations, they can create what's called beneficial mutations. Ibig sabihin, nagiging mabuti para doon sa organism na yan. Minsan, palpak. Kasi sumubok siya ng bagong estilo, hindi pala siya bagay doon sa nilalagyan niya. And nagiging deleterious or not as good for him. So, sa humans, you might have heard this. Meron naman talagang mutations. It occurs in humans. Sa newborn screening, actually, this is yung napansin nyo kapag nanganak, no? Bagong panganak lang, piniprick namin yung heel ng bata. Bakit? Kasi nasa batas yan. May chinecheck kaming 4 na sakit. And one of them is yung tinatawag na G6PD. It's very common sa Filipino. Ang disease na to, kapag meron po yung tao, kapag may kinakain silang bagay o na-expose sa certain things, pumuputok po yung pinaka-red blood cell or yung nagdadala ng oxygen sa blood at nagkakaroon sila ng anemia. No? Yan ang mga G6PD. That's the deleterious effect. Pero meron din pala siyang reason kung ba't nagkaroon ng mutation na to, and it's in response to an environmental pressure which is malaria, which is present in the Philippines. So you'll notice yung mga G6PD na mutations is more common sa mga may tropical areas of the world kasi doon yung mga areas kung saan may mga malaria at kadalasan makikita din yung G6PD, which is a form of a mutational form of evolutionary mutation na to adapt to the situation. So gaya po ng mga viruses, ganun din yung estilo nila. Nag-hijack nga sila ng cell, ang katawan natin or yung immune system ng mga kung ano man ang ini-infect nila ay gagawa ng paraan upang sugpuin sila. So they will evolve, they will mutate accordingly para makaiwas dyan sa mga estratehiya ng immune system natin. Now, what's special about SARS-CoV-2 or yung virus na nagkakos ng COVID-19 is RNA virus siya. Now, para hindi komplikado, isipin nyo na lang kapag RNA ang virus, mas mabilis yan mag-mutate. Mas madali sila mag-mutate kasi yung rate of errors, yung pagkakamali ng sequence or yung pag-change ng sequence is very easy. Yun dun sa kanilang mga RNA. So maraming mga iba't ibang klaseng RNA viruses na you might notice because of this ability to mutate, mahirap talaga silang sugpuin. Kagaya po ng trangkaso, yung influenza, this is the reason why kung papansinin niyo, taon-taon tayo nagva-vaccine kasi mabilis po ang pag-mutate ng virus na to. It's very quick. So every year, kailangan maglabas ng different vaccine for this specific type of virus. Na meron din mga ibang viruses na hanggang ngayon, it's been very elusive. Mahirap talaga gumawa ng vaccine para sa kanya dahil sa bilis ng pag-mutate niya. Gaya ng ito, the red ribbon, it represents yung AIDS, caused by the HIV virus. Both of these are RNA viruses, and by virtue of yung pagiging RNA virus sila, mabilis sila mag-mutate. Kaya, ignore that na lang. So, pero ang nakakapagtaka sa SARS-CoV-2 ay bagamat RNA virus siya, meron din po siyang tinatawag na proofreading ability. Siya lang po sa mga RNA viruses ang mga ganito. What does this mean? Ibig sabihin, hindi siya basta-basta nagluluto. Nagdo-double check po siya. Tinitingnan niya, tama ba yung pagsulat ko dito sa recipe? Parang nag-skip ako ng step. At makikita niya, ay, nakita niya. So, i-correct niya. And the reason why it has to have this is it's the largest RNA genome. Ang problema po, habang lumalaki yung genome, mas tumataas yung mga room for error. And the more errors you have po, the more likely na magiging deleterious yon. Ibig sabihin, hindi magsusurvive. So, ang belief ngayon is yung SARS-CoV, since medyo malaki yung genome niya, it had to introduce some way of double-checking itself. Yung influenza po tsaka yung HIV, wala silang proofreading mechanism, pero they are small enough na hindi nila kailangan. Ang SARS-CoV, kailangan niya may proofreading ability para mabuhay siya. Pero again, when you think about it, edi kung may proofreading ability siya, ba't siya nag-mutate? And that's the point. Dahil meron siyang proofreading ability at dahil marami nakikitang mga variants sa mundo ngayon, it shows just how many people are getting infected by SARS-CoV-2, by yung COVID-19. Sa dami po, as a virus is allowed to infect people habang laganap siya sa populasyon, mas mataas yung chances, mas maraming opportunity po siya mag-mutate. So again, unlike influenza, hindi po siya masyadong nag-mutate. However, dahil sa dami ng tao na nai-infect ng COVID-19, kaya maraming mga mutation ang nangyayari. That's just to give you an idea of the scale of infection at what type of virus we are dealing with here. Yan po. So let's talk about the virus. Ganito ang itsura po niya. Mukha siyang, kaya corona, di ba? Corona, ibig sabihin ng corona, yung crown, it's called the coronavirus kasi mukha siyang corona, no? Kapag tinignan mo siya. And yung mga spikes nito, yung nagbubuo dito sa corona, yun ang talagang binibigyan namin ng pansin. We call it the spike protein kasi mukha po siyang tinik, no? And it's this spike protein po ang kumakabit po sa pinaka-receptor natin sa katawan upang pumasok sa cell. The receptor is called the ACE2 receptor. You might have heard of this. So, yung spike protein, kumakabit siya doon sa ACE2 receptor at pumapasok siya sa human cell. And because of that, yun yung talagang nagbibigay pansin ng mga scientists. Kasi kung kaya mong i-block yan, hindi na siya makakapasok sa cell. So this is a bit complicated, pinapakita ko sa inyo dito. But this is what I mean when I talk about sequences. Kami dito sa Genome Center, ang hilig namin sa mga letra. No? So ang sequence, yun yung mga letra na nakikita nyo dito. At ang gustong ipahiwatig ng image na to is you'll see here itong nakasulat na missense sa 486, no? In this position daw sa sequence na iba, may nawala na isang letra, kaya yung letter yung lumalabas na signal imbes na LEU naging FTHE. And because of these type of changes, lumipat yung virus from a bat dito sa sequence to the human. Kasi what this change means is nag-iiba yung hugis, no? When you think about changes in sequence, ang nag-iiba is yung hugis, no? Very important sa amin sa molecular biology yung mga shape, yung mga hugis. Kasi we look at it in terms of the lock and key. Now, just to go back, itong drawing na to is actually the representation of yung nakita nyong spike kanina. So pansinin nyo, kung yung drawing nito parang simple lang. In reality, mas maraming mga bump, mga hugis-hugis siyang ganyan. And it's very, very specific. Kaya yung analogy namin, para siyang susi at padlock, no? Pansinin nyo, there's one key for one padlock. Very specific kasi yung shape ng mga pinakangipin dito sa key, sa susi. Kaya ganon din po yung nagiging specificity. Kung ano ba yung hugis ng spike protein, siyang mismong kumakabit at sa ACE2 receptor ng human. Because of the mutation that we saw here, yung hugis na dapat kumakabit sa receptor sa bat ay ngayon kumakapit sa receptor ng human. Yan ang effect po ng mutation kaya nagkakaroon ng mga changes po sa virus. So again, yung analogy po, yung spike protein para siyang susi na kumakabit sa padlock doon sa human cell kasi kahugis niya. Now, kaya ang approach po sa pagsugpo sa virus ay to match that. Kung yung virus yung hugis ng kanyang spike protein ay kahugis ng sa human cell namin, ang ginagawa ng katawan, binabasa niya yung hugis na yan para gumawa ng antibody. So yung antibody, siya mismo din kahugis yung spike protein at kakabit naman siya doon. So imbis na kakabit yung virus doon sa human cell, kumakabit siya sa antibody. At kung maraming mga antibody yung kumakabit sa virus, wala na siyang pagkakabitan doon mismo sa cell. So hindi na siya makakapasok sa cell. Ang tawag namin dito is neutralization. Yan ang ibig sabihin. Ganon po yung sistema kung paano po ang virus ay nanoneutralize ng antibody sa loob ng katawan. Ang ginagamit namin is yung pinakahugis ng mismong receptor na nagbibigay ng abilidad doon sa virus upang pumasok sa cell. Okay. Now, let's move into So, alam natin na ganun yung mga antibody. Ang baka tanong ninyo, saan ba galing yung mga antibody na yan? Paano ba nabubuo at how does it go into our vaccines kung ganun nga yung pinag-uusapan? So let's do a short history lesson po. Alam niyo po ba, ang unang vaccine ay ginawa noong late 1700s, si Edward Jenner po. At dahil po ito sa isang observation, may tinatawag na smallpox nung panahon na yon. I think you've heard of the smallpox na delikado yung infection na to, marami pong namamatay siya. Para siyang chickenpox pero mas malala. Ang pangit din ng itsura ng mga pigsa. Medyo malaki siya pero basta pangit siya. Ang napansin niya, observation po niya, yung mga milkmaid. Nung panahon yan kasi yung mga milkmaid, no, sila po yung mga babae na kumukuha ng gata sa baka, no. Sila parang hindi sila masyado nagkakaroon ng smallpox. At kung magkaroon man sila, medyo mas maliit yung mga pigsa na nakuha nila. Yun ang pansin niya, observation niya. And eventually, na-discover niya is kasi dahil exposed yung mga milkmaid sa mga baka, nahahawa pala sila sa tinatawag na cowpox. Isang variant po, isa siyang version ng smallpox, pinsan niya, na hindi gaano naka-infect ng tao. Pero pumapasok pa rin sa katawan ng tao ng mga milkmaids, yung katawan nila pinapansin, although yung virus na yun hindi naka-infect sa tao, napapansin pa rin ng katawan, gumagawa sila ng antibody doon sa cowpox. At kung nahawa naman sila ng mismong smallpox, yung antibody na doon sa cowpox, may pagkamuka yung hugis nila doon sa hugis ng receptor ng smallpox. Kaya nagkakaroon sila ng immunity or slight immunity doon sa smallpox. Hindi siya perfect kasi hindi based mismo sa smallpox, but it's close enough na nakakakuha sila ng partial immunity. And that was the start of what we would call vaccinology doon sa napansin. Sa ngayon, we don't do that anymore. We don't get look-alike viruses and then infect people with them. Ngayon, we use the same principle. Ang gagawin natin is bibigyan ka namin ng version ng virus na medyo similar or based doon sa virus para maunahan mo yung virus bago ka ma-infect ng todo, merong nakagawang antibody na ang katawan ninyo. And these are the traditional ways we've done it. Meron tinatawag na live attenuated tsaka inactivated. They're quite similar. Ang ibig sabihin ng live sorry, may konting lag. Yan. Ibig sabihin ng live attenuated, yung mismong virus siya, pero tinanggal namin yung pinaka-receptor na makakabit doon sa cells ninyo. Kumbaga, they cannot infect you. So, that's one example. Some of the flu vaccines are live attenuated. Meron din inactivated. Ibig sabihin nito, yung mismong virus destroyed na siya. So it's incapable. Kaya sabi ko they're quite similar. Yung live attenuated tsaka inactivated, they're similar. So the simpler way is yung live attenuated mahina, no? So weakened siya. At yung inactivated, patay. Ibig sabihin nun. Ang point lamang naman po ito is para kilalanin ng katawan ninyo, yan ang itsura niya, yan ang hugis niya, yan ang itsura ng kalaban. Sige, aalamin ko. Meron din mga toxoid, no? Toxoids are specific proteins that are produced by, in this case, it's a bacteria. So, ginagamit namin yan para maging familiar din ng katawan dun sa toxoid ng bacteria na yan. And then meron din mga recombinant. Ito, we actually create proteins based dun sa sequence na nakukuha. At yung ginagamit namin pang-create mga bacteria. So sa lab, kino-culture namin yung, parang nilalagyan namin yung sequence dun sa loob ng bacteria. Yung bacteria nagma-manufacture ng protein. Tapos, pinapurify namin yung protein na yon. So, walang virus involved, bale. But, yung nabuong protein is the same as the protein that you'll find in the viruses. So to make it simple, yung unang dalawang to, yung pula tsaka yung dilaw, mga involving the virus, and then yung green tsaka yung purple na to, indirectly involving the virus. Basta, the main point of all of vaccination is parang information gathering. Yung analogy I like to give, para siyang sa military. Bago ka magsagawa ng operasyon, kailangan may impormasyon ka dun sa kalaban ninyo, or else nako, ang laki ng casualties ninyo, no? So information is very important. When it comes to yung mga virus, kapag meron kang early information tungkol sa itsura, hugis, galaw ng kalaman ninyo, masusugpuan mo kaagad siya. That's how our immune system works. And again, we are talking about hugis. Kasi if you liken it sa itsura ng tao, parang ganoon din ang impormasyon mo if you're looking for a certain suspect, no? Kung tawagin, Pilipino siya, na ilang taon siya, may pagkaganito yung mukha niya, maganito yung labi niya. So, yung mga features ng face, siya ding features na hinahanap ng antibodies natin na kinakabitan nila doon sa virus. Now, just so you know, antibodies are also capable of slight variation, no? Kung ang virus ng kung yung viruses meron silang mga genetic variants, yung katawan when it makes antibodies actually creates slight variations of the same antibody. So, kumbaga, you can think of it in terms of sa military, hindi lang naman isang tao halimbawa ang alam mong kalaban. Kung alam mo yung kalaban ninyo is isang grupo, no? Then there are certain characteristics of the group na alam mong dapat mong tingnan, no? So, halimbawa, kapag yung kalaban ninyo ay isang grupong rebelde, hindi lang naman isang tao ang description ninyo dyan. It's the group. So, ganun din yung idea ng how antibodies work. They have an ability to understand yung similarities dun sa group. So, kahit may konting variation, makikilala din niya at masasabi, ay kasama siya sa grupo na yan, susugpuin ko na yan. So, regardless of the variation. However, as time goes by and as more mutations, more the variant is much, much further away, mapapansin nyo, kasama na ba to? Kano ito eh. Kasama kaya ito? Parang medyo magkaiba na yung hugis dun sa nalaman ko from before. So therefore, this brings up the idea of how variants can impact vaccines. It becomes a race na sino bang mauuna in terms of variation. Will the virus mutate in such a speed to the point na yung katawan natin nalilito na hindi na siya sure kung siya ba o hindi. Now, before I go on to talk about yung specific variants and how they impact, let's talk about konting alaman. Kasi alam ko minsan yung media nagtatapon-tapon sila ng mga letters and numbers na to and nako-confuse kayo. Ako, for your sake, just get familiar with this one kasi this one's quite standard, yung naming. We name the mutation, okay? So, kapag nakikita kayo ng dalawang letra na nasa gitna nila is a bunch of numbers, that's a mutation. Okay? So, kasi ang style namin dito, yung unang letter, yan ang original na nandoon. Yung G, yung kung ano napagpulitan. And then yung number na to is yung location doon. So, itong D614G, I'm sure you've heard it a lot. No, this is the current predominant mutation that you will find in most variants. More than 80% ng lahat ng umiikot na variants, kung ano man sila, contains this specific mutation. Okay, yun ang ibig sabihin noon. Now, yun, like I said, D614G, yun ang predominant. Siya din po ang, yung minsan ibang mutations na to, based on clinical characteristics, we're able to say, when this variant is present, parang these characteristics are associated with it. Associated is the key, ha? Hindi caused by it, it's associated. So yung mga napansin niyo at some point, 'di ba, sinabi nila kapag nawalan kayo ng ng pangamoy o panlasa, automatic you are a suspect. You're a probable case. So quarantine ka agad at swab. Kasi they found an association kapag nawala yung panlasa at merong present na D614G mutation na na virus. Now, there are other ones. Yung UK variant, you might have heard, that has the N501Y. No, I'll talk about it later. And yung South African, magtataka kayo, tsaka yung Brazilian, it's also in the Brazilian. Magtataka kayo, bakit medyo alanganin tayo sa Brazilian and we're hoping hindi talaga siya umabot dito. It has the E484K mutation. Ito naman kasi has been found na mahirap kumabit yung existing antibodies that are generated from the vaccines sa kanya. So it has what's known as the escape mutation. Ito yung medyo binabantayan po natin. But before I move on, just light treatment. So if it doesn't follow this convention, yung letter, number, letter, kapag halimbawa B1.1.17, mga ganon, wag nyo munang, don't pay too much attention. That's just one method of how we label the viruses. Kasi depende po sa software na ginagamit po namin, meron din kanyang kaakibat na naming nomenclature or system. So yung B1.1.17, that's using the pangolin software. If you're using a different software, iba din ang tawag. But just to make things simpler, tawagin na lang natin UK variant. Tapos na yan. Pero yung mutations, they are pretty much the same. They won't change. So kapag nakita kayo ng mga letter, number, letter, again, that's a mutation. So yun ang papansinin ninyo. Okay? So what's the SARS-CoV-2 UK variant? Ito, na-identify po siya noong 20th ng September last year na po. And na-identify po siya kasi nagkaroon ng mga outbreaks. And this is usually the start of how na-identify yung mga variants. Kapag wala namang pagbabago doon sa ginagawa ninyo mga minimum public health standards, no? And ang understanding niyo ay masunod naman ng mga tao, wala namang pinagbago doon sa pero nagkakaroon ng spikes in infection. Ang assumption is assuming all things equal, baka nagkaroon ng variation doon sa virus, kailangan imbestigahan. And true enough, na-identify nila doon yung variant dito sa mga outbreaks na to. And it was determined po, yung lineage na to confers more infectivity. Now, itong graph, ang gusto ko lang sabihin dito is, nakita nyo yung spot dito sa taas. Hindi lumalabas yung pointer ko. Di bale. Anyway, basically, ang sinasabi lang ng chart na to is maraming mga mutations na nakita sa B117, yung UK variant na more than expected kung tawagin. Kasi yung rate of mutation, yung dami ng changes na nangyayari doon sa sequence over time, ay sa kanya mas mataas than expected. And that's why ang assumption nila galing sa mga taong chronically infected. Na may halimbawa, meron sila, they're taking immunosuppressive drugs, or meron silang mga reasons kung bakit hindi completely matanggal yung virus sa katawan, kaya nahahayaan siya mag-multiply doon sa loob ng katawan. And as that happens, nagkakaroon ng new mutations and variations while inside that person. So yun lang yung assumption nila kung saan nanggaling. And it's true because yung sa UK, medyo challenging ang situation nila kasi karamihan ng mga patients nila ay matatanda. And that will require a lot of resuscitative efforts, yung mga critical care, kung kaya in hospitals, and which might, I'm not saying it causes, ito association lang, yan yung grounds for the possibility na baka magkaroon ng mga variations. If yung mga critical care patients na since protracted yung disease length nila, nagkakaroon ng opportunities for the virus to to mutate in their bodies. Now, ito yung mga significant mutations sa UK variant, yung binanggit ko na N501. Ito yung sinasabi natin mas makapit sa human receptor. So it increases infectivity. No. So ito yung rason kung bakit nila sasabi it's more infectious than the older variant, yung D614G. Mas dikit na dikit siya doon sa ano. So not only is it more infectious, ang ibig sabihin nun, you need less virus in order to infect someone. So it's very easy to infect someone with yung N501Y. Yun ang ibig sabihin nun. Meron din mga ibang mutation dito, yung 681H. That's another one. It facilitates the entry. Yung sa Brazilian na binanggit ko kanina, this one, yung E484K, yan nga yung binabantayan namin. Kasi this one has been shown to have escape dun sa mga antibodies natin. And that's the reason why when we do yung mga studies namin to, we already have, based sa pag-aaral, yung mga variants and mutants that are of concern. And that's the reason why ginagawa namin itong biosurveillance. Kasi bago pa magkaroon ng outbreaks at ma-identify ang variant, dapat hinahanapan na namin yung mga variants na to in the population. And that's the reason why kailangan yung biosurveillance. Kasi remember, hindi lang naman sa labas ng bansa lamang nanggagaling yung mga variants, no? Hindi we label them as UK variant kasi doon siya unang na identify, but that does not mean na sa labas lamang pong nanggagaling. It does not mean that mutation ay galing lang talaga sa UK at tapos na. It might have been na yung same mutation na yan would have occurred elsewhere in the world. It just so happens na nahanap siya sa UK. But the point being is it is also possible habang laganap yung virus at hinahayaan siya mag-multiply at mag-spread sa population na magkaroon ng mga variants that may at some point dahil sa pagbago dun sa hugis become more infectious or more virulent or more severe. And that's why we need to do the surveillance to make sure yung una pa lang matatagpuan namin yung mga variants na to ay we can do the efforts to prevent its spread. Siya. Now, dinagdag ko to kasi alam ko hot topic to. On the one hand, natutuwa ako na yung mga tao ay kusa silang nag-aaral at nagbabasa tungkol sa mga vaccines, and that's nice. However, at the same time, minsan nakakahinayan na yung information is not as accurate or minsan may mga specific things or mga technicalities na mahirap intindihin. And not everyone has a virologist, immunologist friend na pwede nilang lapitan, di ba? So, ano tong mga dalawang bago? Ako, just to be clear, I do not represent any of these vaccines, kaya hindi ko sasabihin yung mga pangalan nila. But I will talk about it in terms of the technology. No? Yung apat na binanggit kong traditional methods na ginagawa natin, intindihin natin that these are all made in the laboratory. They require using viruses, isolating them, infecting bacterial cells, isolating, purifying. It takes a lot of time. Kaya yung average vaccine release time, umaabot ng higit 10 taon, no? Para lang makalabas ng bagong vaccine. The fastest the vaccine was ever released was actually the MMR, yung sa measles, no? And measles, mumps, rubella. This was 4 years. Medyo mabilis siya. Kung kaya yung COVID-19 vaccine in 1 year span is actually very impressive. And part of the reason why we were able to do that, bukod sa not only because of not to understate the efforts of the global effort na ginawa ng mga tao to make this possible, there are also new technologies that will allow us to create vaccines much quicker, no? And I say new kasi yung this technology actually more than 10 years old na to. It's just that there was no opportunity yet to apply it, in as widespread as a manner. Pero yun nga, nangyari ito. So, nagamit natin. And these new technologies, yung tinatawag na mRNA vaccine, tsaka yung adenovirus vaccine. You heard me say mRNA kanina, yung messenger RNA. So, kumbaga, yung mRNA vaccine is essentially yung information that codes for the viral protein. Now, traditionally, ang ginagawa namin, pinapasok namin to sa isang bacteria sa laboratorio, hinahayaman namin yung bacteria gumawa ng protein na yan, pinapurify namin yung protein, tsaka pa lang namin ilalagay sa tao. So you notice the additional steps. The idea of an mRNA vaccine is, hindi mo na kailangan i-proliferate sa isang bacteria sa laboratorio, idiretso mo na sa tao. At yung mismong mga cells sa katawan nila ang gagawa ng protein, at yung protein na yan ay ma-identify ng immune system at tuloy-tuloy na yung paggawa ng antibody. Now you might ask, ba't hindi nagawa dati? No? And the reason is because of what you see here, yung mga cons. No? It requires a technology to protect the mRNA. Kasi kapag hindi mo pinrotect yung mRNA yan, kapag ka-inject ko sa katawan ninyo, nako, madidegrade ka agad yan. There are a lot of things in the environment, even in the blood, that will degrade the RNA. Kasi kung isipin ninyo, yung RNA kasi isang strand lang siya. So yung nakita niyo yung drawing na to, mukha siyang suklay, 'di ba? Yung parts dito sa dulo na nakalawit, they're very sensitive. That contains the information ng specific sequence. So since exposed siya, madali yan masira, no? And that's why yung problem sa mRNA, I'm sure you heard of it, sinasabi, kailangan nakastore sa specific temperature. Kapag binuksan siya, kailangan ubusin ka agad lahat. Wala silang single vial preparation, wala silang single shot preparation. They're all vial na kinukuhanan ng dose. Because of the way the vaccines have to be prepared. Kasi very bulk order ginagawa, we have to release lots of vaccines in such a short amount of time, kaya wala silang single preparation na pwede ibigay. So all of these logistical factors makes mRNA vaccines quite challenging, lalo na sa mga situations kagaya ng Pilipinas where logistics might not be in our favor, especially sa mga far-flung areas. Tandaan ninyo po, we live in an archipelago. Yung biosurveillance project natin po, kung saan may nagsasubmit ng samples, ay hindi lamang po sa NCR. Ginagawa din po sa Cebu, sa Mindanao, at kung sa iba't ibang region ng bansa. However, ako, nahihirapan pa lang ako na makakuha ng samples na umabot sa akin kasi nauubusan sila ng dry ice o wala silang mahahanapan na para ma-maintain yung temperature to transport yung samples to us here sa NCR. So kung nahihirapan na tayo mag-transport ng samples for testing, what more itong mga vaccine? I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm just saying it's very challenging. Just so you understand why it's also important to consider other ways. Kasi if we're tied to a single form of vaccine, they were also tied to the restrictions that it has. Diba? Yung mga cons niya. So ano yung isa pa? Adenovirus. Diba sabi ko yung mRNA virus, mukha siyang suklay, exposed yung mga ngipin niya dito kaya madaling masira. Yung adenovirus vaccine, DNA siya. So it uses the same idea. Ipapasok natin yung information dun sa katawan at then yung katawan ang gagawa ng protein. Pero imbes sa RNA, DNA. Yung DNA parang dalawang RNA na magkadikit, na slightly different yung bases. So since walang naka-expose ng ngipin, mas matibay siya. Ang problema lang, mahirap siyang pumasok sa cell. Itong maliit na supply na to, madali siyang pumasok sa cell. Kusa siyang kayang pumasok. Ito, nahihirapan. So what they need to do is they put it inside what's called a vector. In this case, adenovirus. That's why it has the name adenovirus in its name. Kasi gumagamit siya ng ibang viral vector para makapasok yung Now, before you freak out, kasi sasabihin din niyo, hala, edi parang panibagong virus yan. Yes and no. We've been using, we call these vectors. We've been using it for a very long time sa molecular biology. Kumbaga, hinijack lang namin yung mechanisms ng viruses. But they do not contain enough information to create more viruses. So ang ginagamit lang namin parang payload to deliver the DNA, the payload into the cell. Now, dahil ganito yung itsura niya, it is more robust. No? It has the pro na mas mabilis siyang i-develop, no? Kasi hindi mo kailangan yung pag-grow ng bacteria sa lab. At mas durable siya. So kaya niyang i-transport at higher temperatures. Hindi mo yung kailangan na sobrang lamig na lamig, sub-zero temperatures. Now, ang problem is, since it's using a virus, yung viral vector, di yung katawan mo, kaya din niyang gumawa ng antibody against that vector. So at some point, yung virus na to, may inactivate ng sarili mong immune system. Hindi siya magiging effective. So this vaccine, actually, the con is more on the developer. Kasi every now and then, kailangan niya gumawa ng update, parang computer program, na iibahin niya ng konti yung hugis ng virus na to para hindi siya maatake ng sarili nating katawan. Kumbaga, yung katawan natin nagkakaroon ng immunity doon sa mismong vaccine. Ito lang yung issue ng adenovirus vaccine. Now, all I'm trying to say here is, all vaccines have their pros and cons. They are all good because they are all designed for the same purpose, which is to prevent infection. Because at the end of the day, the point of vaccine po is to create what's called herd immunity. No? I'm pretty sure narinig niyo yung concept na to. Tinatawag sa herd immunity. Kailangan yung herd immunity. Ang ibig sabihin lang nito, the more people na nakakuha ng vaccine sa population, the more you can protect those na hindi pa vaccinated. Yan ang ibig sabihin nun. So, halimbawa dito sa drawing na to, yung mga hindi vaccinated na naka-blue. Tapos yung vaccinated na naka-bitaw. Tapos yung may infection yung pula. Since magkatabi yung pula doon sa lahat ng blue, edi lahat sila maging pula. Diba? Ganun lang siya. Pero kapag in-immunize mo, parang pansinin nyo yung dilaw, sila yung mga vaccinated. ay parang gumagawa sila ng shield o pinapalibutan nila yung mga may infection at yung mga hindi pa vaccinated. Ito yung ibig sabihin natin sa herd immunity. Dahil napapalibutan ng mga may infection ng mga vaccinated, hindi na nakakaabot doon sa hindi pa vaccinated. So yung pulang ito, hindi na siya dikit doon sa blue, hindi na niya kayang i-infect yung blue. Kung kaya yung mga dilaw na to are the herd. They are the ones that protect. Para silang panangga. Panangga doon sa mga hindi pa vaccinated. And that's important, especially sa populations that we cannot vaccinate, like infants, yung very young, or yung mga individuals that are receiving that have conditions that when affected yung immune system nila. Kagaya ng mga may cancer, halimbawa they're taking chemotherapy, so hindi sila pwede mag-vaccinate, or yung mga patients that have chronic rheumatic disorders, so yung mga autoimmune diseases. Yung mga patients na to, nagbibigay kami ng mga gamot na nagpapababa dun sa immune system nila. Kung kaya hindi magiging epektibo ang mga vaccine kapag binigay namin sa kanila. So for them, that's why it's also important na may herd immunity, kasi kahit hindi sila na-vaccinate, at least yung kapwa nilang nakapalibot sa kanila ay nagpoprotekta sa kanya. Yan ang ibig sabihin po ng herd immunity. Now, which brings us to the idea of, paano naman ang herd immunity kung hindi naman effective ang vaccine? I've heard that, no? Kasi ngayon, na-expose na yung mga tao sa tinatawag na effectiveness. And, numbers don't lie. People will say, ba't naman yung isa, mas mababa yung effectivity, dun lang ako sa mas effective. Let's put this into context first, no? Ang COVID vaccines, you see them here, they're reported here. The efficacy is dependent, syempre, dun sa virus na pinag-uusapan. Ang polio, German measles, these are DNA viruses. Tendency is they don't mutate as much, kaya very effective. Ang COVID-19, tandaan ninyo, sabi ko, although RNA virus siya, it has proofreading ability. So it doesn't mutate as much. So I'm expecting it to have some reasonable efficacy. Pero yung mga seasonal flu actually, this mutates a lot. Kaya pansinin nyo, ang pangit ng efficacy niya if you relate the numbers dun sa nakasanayan natin. So, pansinin ninyo, yung COVID-19 numbers, ganon. But when you look at the seasonal flu, sa amin, it's okay if it's around 60, 70, ganon. Because what does efficacy mean when you're talking about it in a number? It refers to the ability of the vaccine to prevent the disease in the populations it's meant to prevent. Ibig sabihin, minimeasure nila yung mga tao na nakakuha ng infection after receiving the vaccine. Pero, it does not mean that if you receive a vaccine but you got the disease, ay hindi ka nakinabang dyan. What does that mean? In this study, last year to ginawa, they were looking at the effects on the incidence, severity, and the cost effectiveness of vaccination strategies in relation dun sa efficacy. Now, alam ko medyo mahirap intindihin to, pero stick with me, ha? So yung first graph na to, parang gumana yung pointer ko. Ayaw gumana yung pointer ko. Nakita nyo yung mouse ko? Nakita nyo?
Yes, Doc.
Ayun.
Gumagalaw
siya. Okay. So itong unang graph dito, no? This graph looks at yung as we move from left to right, ganon, it's the number of people who are vaccinated in a population. Na kapag yung 1, ibig sabihin lahat ng tao na vaccinate siya, no? Obviously, as more people are vaccinated, mas kumukonte yung mga na-infect. Yan yung mga itong taas nito. So halimbawa kapag walang vaccinated, yung blue na to, that means over 20 million po ang infections, no? And this is in the US as of 2019, no? With the assumption na yung efficacy ng vaccine mo is only 19%. Okay, yun ang ibig sabihin na to. So walang vaccinated, pangit pa yung vaccine niyo, ang dami ma-infect. Ibig sabihin nun. Now, the colors here just represent the age groups. So we'll focus with the blue one kasi yan yung common age group, yung mga working age group yan. Okay? Now, what does it mean if your vaccine naman is 44% effective? This was the estimated efficacy in 2019 kasi. What that means is, even if you only vaccinate less than 10% of your population, with a vaccine efficacy of 44%, naibababa mo yung incidence sa less than 5 million. Ngayon sasabihin niyo, paano yan nangyari? 44% lang. The other effect of vaccines is that even if you do contract the virus, yung infection, the severity is much less. Kasi ang ibig lang sabihin nun is hindi sapat yung pagbuo ng antibody, pero it only became partially effective. Ako, meron po akong experience ng ganito, ng isang pasyente ko, 75-year-old na inadmit sa ospital. Kasi nung dumating siya sa ER, meron lang po siyang lagnat, konting ubo. Pagka-x-ray namin, napakapangit ang itsura ng ng chest x-ray niya. Pero si Lola mismo, masigla. Madali siyang kausap, hindi naman hinihingal. But we wanted to admit her kasi for observation. At nung nasa floors na siya, tinanong ko siya, Nay, na-vaccinate ka ba? Sabi niya, oo. Na-vaccinate siya 2 months ago. Sabi niya, alam mo, Nay, buti na lang na-vaccinate kayo. Kasi tingin ko kapag wala kayong vaccination, baka nasa ICU na kayo. Yan ang ibig sabihin po ng what vaccines can also do. It's not just about preventing the disease, it's also reducing the severity na nakikita dito. So, not only does it decrease, ito naman, we're looking at hospitalization, yung dami ng tao na na-hospitalize. So, pansinin nyo, from 90%, kahit 44% effective, nababawasan na more than 75, na more than half yung numbers ng ano. So, this is what we mean. Kapag naririnig nyo parang, ay, 70% effective, parang pangit. It still has a profound effect. It might not be as good as yung 90 ng mga iba, but it is still a profound effect. Okay? And but that's not to say na magsesettle tayo sa lower efficacy. Of course, the higher the efficacy, the better. But what I'm saying is do not discount a vaccine just because it's rated at a lower efficacy rate. Kasi ito naman yung sa deaths. Deaths din also decrease. Kasi true efficacy can only be determined once the vaccine is in the population. Kasi tandaan ninyo, yung mga studies na ginagawa ng mga company ng mga vaccine developers is based on very small controlled clinical trials because ganun talaga po to determine the safety. They have to do that. But as it is deployed in the community and then we're able to measure yung totoong efficacy, dun lamang po namin nakikita. Pero bukod po sa pag-prevent ng mismong infection, it also decreases the severity, which is what is important. And decreasing severity also decreases the number of days that you are infectious. And you increase the number of days that you're infectious, you decrease the possibility of you transmitting the disease. Kung ikaw po ay kahit na vaccinate at nahawaan din po, yung tagal ng paghawa ninyo at yung panahon na maaaring makakahawa ka ng iba ay mas lalong umiikli. And because of that, that decreases the spread. And it is still maganda pa rin ang effect. That's what I'm trying to say. Kaya, medyo nahihinayin nga po ako na the discussion has been focused on efficacy when that should not be the point. Wala naman po kami mga dalubhasa, wala kaming masyadong ano sa efficacy. What is most important, I'm not saying na hindi important. What I'm saying is, that's good. It's good to know the efficacy. However, the focus should be one, safety. Dapat safe siya. Lahat ng adverse events dapat naka-document. And when I say adverse events, hindi yung yung nagkaroon ng headache and fever. Those are adverse events, but they are minor. They're side effects. Yung adverse events, we're talking about unexpected death or mga severe reactions resulting in harm that will require ICU. These events have been isolated. Ilan lang. That's why kailangan ng proper reporting and investigation upang malaman yung pinaka-cause, no? But safety is the first and foremost. Logistic compliance, especially in the case of yung mga vaccines that are very sensitive, yung mahirap i-transport. Kasi kung palpak ang pag-transport ninyo ng vaccine, nawawalan ng bisa yung mga yan. Di bali na 70% effective. Kung pangit naman ang pagdala-dala ng vaccine na pag-roll out, 0% efficacy naman. So logistic compliance is important, and the rollout strategy. It's not just a question of may bisa ba yung vaccine, safe and but also to get the vaccine to people. You have to have a rollout strategy. How are you and this is very complex, no? Kasi tandaan ninyo, yung vaccine, yung pagkuha ng vaccine in the world, agawan yan sa ngayon. And the manufacturers also are creating a lot of vaccines and very constrained yung production lines. So it becomes, how are we able to stagger out yung pag-acquire ng vaccine from multiple vendors para walang butal-butal sa pag-roll out ng vaccine? Mahirap po, nakikita ngayon sa US pero they're able to catch up. Mahirap yung may wave ng pag-vaccinate tapos bigla na lang nawala, no? Especially for mga vaccines that require 2 doses. Mahirap po yung magbigay ng first dose tapos wala ka palang pang second dose. The rollout strategy is very critical and it needs to be done in such a way that there's a continuous, steady delivery of vaccines. Because again, ang habol natin is the herd immunity. Again, basta ma-vaccinate ang tao, and the efficacy, even if it's yung narinig nyo yung mababang numbers, basta ang cutoff namin just to be clear kasi baka you might go with the impression na wala akong pakialam sa efficacy. Hindi. Ang World Health Standard for initial vaccine rollout efficacy is at least 50%. And I showed it to you already why. Kasi even at 44%, there's effect. Pero if it's below 50%, that's when we start requesting for reevaluation of vaccine efficacy and based dun sa sa antibody, how good the antibody actually interfaces with the virus. But that being said, ngayon ang strategiya shouldn't be the discussion shouldn't be on which vaccine should I get. The question should be is like, how can I receive the vaccine in a timely manner that is safe? Ganon dapat yung nagiging usapan. Unfortunately, and wala naman akong I'm not blaming anyone. Unfortunately, the way that the discussion has been framed ay tungkol lahat dito sa numbers, the noises of like bakit ito mas effective dito hindi ginagamit. Kasi, and I understand, kasi very complex po itong immunology at mahirap din ipaliwanag sa mga tao. At minsan, yung mga mahahabang diskusyon na to, that's why I'm very thankful na ang UP gave me the opportunity to share this with you. Kailangan talaga mag-sit down. Kailangan talaga makinig para maintindihan at mas makakuha ng kaalaman tungkol sa topic na to because it is not simple. No? It's very complex. And granted na we are also still learning a lot because this is the last time a pandemic like this happened is 100 years ago. So, wag kayong magulat kung naninibago yung mga tao even at the high but at the very least we are approaching it with the science that we know. It is being approached with evidence-based science, and that's the way it should be. Na minsan we are being blamed yung mga scientists na parang wala kaming alam. Kasi kami mga scientists, sa totoo lang, we approach things with the assumption na wala talaga kaming alam, because it's in that humility that we're able to learn more about the virus, and we do not fall into the dangers of assumptions. Yan yung gusto kong ipahiwatig sa inyo. So yung summary po dito. Mutations, no? At to summarize, ang mga mutation, mga genetic events to, no? Yung pagbabago doon mismo sa recipe na nagbubuo ng mga protina sa katawan, no? And it is a environmental response. Adaptation po nila yan doon sa mga stressors sa environment. Kumbaga, ang virus ng COVID or kahit anumang virus, kapag nag-infect sa katawan, habang as our body fights it, sila din po gumagawa ng mga paraan upang makaiwas sa mismong immune system natin. Kaya nagkakaroon sila ng mutation. Variants and strains are collections of mutations, no? They are characterizations, no? They are styles ng pagluluto. Iba't ibang style ng sinigang, halimbawa. And they are important because they have implications on vaccine efficacy and also on epidemiology. Yung kumbaga kapag may variant of interest, then it might have implications on how, halimbawa like yung sa UK variant ngayon, how easily it spreads. So just which is to say, marami pong variants ang nangyayari as a result of mutation, but not all variants ay kailangan tutukan. Yung mga may significance lang sa epidemiology and sa vaccine efficacy ang tinututukan namin. And the UK variant is one such variant. And it's important, tinututukan namin kasi we know that it has an increased infectivity. Because as the virus is allowed to spread, more mutations occur, and that has implications on the efficacy of our vaccine. So it's a race to vaccinate at sugpuin yung virus bago siya makapag-mutate ulit. So early detection and characterization of these variants is important, no? And will help us, again, limit and mitigate the spread and also evaluate yung efficacy ng vaccines natin sa current situation. And lastly, vaccination is essential, and concerns with efficacy should be replaced with demand for safety and efficiency in distribution. Ang usapan po sana ay hindi po kung may bisa ang vaccine o hindi, kasi sa totoo lamang meron pong bisa at naipapakita naman sa mga studies. Ang dapat na pag-uusapan ay paano po namin maibibigay at makukuha ang vaccine sa pamaraan na ligtas at malawak na maibigay sa lahat ng tao na kinakailangan ng vaccine. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. May konting acknowledgements po sa Executive Director namin po sa Philippine Genome Center, si Dr. Cynthia Saloma, sa DNA Core Sequencing Facility and the Core Facility for Bioinformatics led by Dr. Maralit and Dr. Yap. Sila po yung mga nasa likod po ng sequencing efforts, yung mga gumagawa ng mga report na binibigay namin sa DOH ukol sa mga variants, sila po yung gumagawa. It's a very complex, tedious task. Magaling po sila. I'm very, very honored to be able to work with such talented scientists. And of course, yung mga kinakatawan ng DOST-PC-HRD para sa mga gamit that we're using for the Genomics Biosurveillance Program. Ang Philippine Genome Center po lamang ang nakakagawa ng high throughput sequencing, which allows us to do 750 whole genome sequences in a single run. Kung kaya as of today, we've already been able to sequence the whole genomes of over 1,000 different COVID-19 infections identified in the country. And of course, the DOH and DOH-EB, USEC Vejeres Santiago, and also sa DOH-EB si Dr. De Guzman. So thank you very much, and I'm open to any questions po.
Maraming salamat, Doc Edsel. Napaka-liwanag ng inyong presentation. Meron na tayong feedback na nagsasabi na natutuwa sila dun sa ginamit ninyong analogy ng cookbook. So madali siyang maunawaan ng mga tao. Okay, meron tayong
sa pagkain kaya.
Oo. Okay, meron tayong ilang mga tanong na pumasok. Basahin ko lang. Can you please comment on the following? Survey showed low percent of Filipinos want to be vaccinated. And 2, is it okay to have side effects of COVID-19 vaccines than to have symptoms of COVID-19?
Okay, sige. So sa first part, comment on the low percent of Filipinos. It's unfortunate, no? But at the same time, the context is understandable. Bakit? Una, there's a lot of confusion, no? The pandemic has allowed for a lot of people access to social media. At minsan, hindi natin maiiwasan na may nagpo-proliferate na information na not the best. No? And it has caused a lot of misinformation and misunderstandings about the virus and also yung intention ng government. No? But at the same time, the other context we're coming from was what happened in 2017 sa Dengvaxia. That was another unfortunate event that has harmed yung confidence in vaccines. So ang comment ko lang dun sa low percentage of Filipinos wanting to be vaccinated, it's unfortunate but it's understandable. No? Hindi naman ako galit na galit sa tao na bakit kayo hindi nila alam. I understand. And that's why it becomes a challenge. Kasi tayong mga may alam, tayo pong mas nakakaintindi o gustong umintindi, ay meron din pong responsibility to help, spread the awareness and to also reassure people and to encourage yung vaccination. Because sa totoo lang, vaccination is kind of like charity. Ang nakikinabang po sa vaccination is not just yourself, it's actually the community, people at large. That's why yung mga strategies sa vaccination, pansinin nyo, we're looking at herd immunity %. And most vaccines, they start to fail kapag yung herd immunity, yung number ng tao na vaccinated drops below a certain percentage. For some viruses like measles, if it's below 92%, wala na. You already start seeing an increase in infections. So I think it's a combination of increasing awareness and rebuilding yung trust and confidence of people in vaccine. Alam ko it won't happen overnight, but it has to start somewhere. Yung sa second, the side effects of the vaccines, is it okay? Yes. Kasi remember, the side effects that you'll experience dun sa vaccine is the natural response of the body. It's the immune system's response to the vaccine. But the vaccine itself will not cause the infection. Tandaan ninyo, that's the difference. Yung symptoms of COVID-19 caused by the disease will mean you are infectious. But symptoms that you receive from the vaccine, you will not be infectious. Now, what you have to remember about these side effects is this is a response of the immune system. Kapag kayo po ay nahawaan or your body is infected by something, yung mga immune system responses are the ways that your body handles it. It nagre-release sila ng mga substances that cause those symptoms. So, for example, in patients that are immunocompromised but they are eligible for a vaccine, ibig sabihin, meron, halimbawa, binibigyan ko siya ng gamot na nagpapahina ng kanyang immune system, pero pwede pa rin siya mabigyan ng vaccine. Kapag binigyan ko siya ng vaccine, kapag nagkasintoma siya, side effects, I'm actually happy. Kasi ibig sabihin nun, meron pa rin konting galaw yung kanyang immune system. And I'm more assured na makukuha niya yung immunity na gusto ko kesa naman na wa-effect siya, wala siyang nararamdaman. Now, that's not to say na if you're a healthy individual, binigyan kita ng vaccine at wala kang symptoms, ibig sabihin wa-effect yung vaccine. No. People have different reactions to the different vaccines. And that's why it goes back again to being able to monitor and also see ilan ba sa mga tao itong nagkakaroon ng side effects. Usually, yung side effects of vaccines, at least for the more recent, the ones that we have experienced with clinically, ang side effects are usually less than 2% of the population. It's quite small. So I would like to advise, however, yung side effect profile na yan is still not yet known for the new vaccines, ha? Yung mga mRNA tsaka yung adenoviral vaccines. We're not exactly sure yet of the population, yung kung gaano kalaganap po ang adverse, yung side effects po ng vaccines yan in the population. It's still to be seen. But for the traditional ones, usually less than 2%, sometimes 5%. But that's why I caution people when you see people tweet or sa Facebook, whichever you use about, ay, nakaano ako na, that is not, do not make that the general reflection of what the true trend is. Remember, that is one person in several million. So, try to look at it in the context of the pandemic. Kasi it's very easy for people to fearmonger and to create this sensationalization of things that are understandable and expected events. So actually that's on our part as doctors to properly educate you na minsan magkakaroon din kayo ng side effect. Pero that's to be expected as part of the vaccine. But that being said, we also have to monitor and be careful of the more severe side effects, yung mga requiring hospitalization. Kasi yun, kailangan mas may investigation yung mga yan.
Salamat, Doc Ayes. Meron palang nagre-request kung pwede daw kayong mag-Taglish.
Taglish?
Oo.
Pwede ba?
Mula sa FB, what could have been the cause of death of elderlies in Norway after getting the vaccine? Tapos, tuloy ko na dun sa isa pang set of questions. How about allergic reactions? Do they need to test first? I've had allergies to antibiotics, for instance. How do I go about vaccination? So,
Okay.
yung munang cause of death ng mga matatanda sa Norway.
Okay, good question. Ngayon, that's still under investigation. Although, what I will mention is, association is not causation. Okay? So, it's very tempting, no, to assume that yung bago lang sa kanila is binigyan sila ng vaccine, that by virtue of recency, kumbaga yung recency of events, siya yung reason, no? We caution people with regard to that kasi remember, this is an elderly population. Marami silang mga ibang sakit, and we need to investigate if the vaccine really did have a role, if not anything at all, dun sa kanilang pagkamatay. Right now, it's still too early to make any assumptions as to what the causes might be. Pero again, I would defer to what the results of the investigation would be. Anong isa? Yung
allergic reactions.
Allergic reactions. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yung vaccines kasi, especially if you have allergies to antibiotics, ang vaccines kasi they're slightly different. Although it's understandable na if you are allergic to certain antibiotics, you there may be a chance na you might have some reaction, but not to the extent of a severe anaphylactic, yung talagang requiring hospitalization. It can happen, but it's very low. I think, for example, yung mga cases where that has happened is less than 1%, which again, it goes back to what I mentioned, na that's why there is monitoring for mga adverse events, because it's very difficult to determine what 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 component of the vaccine might have triggered it. But in general, most of the vaccines that, I mean, I'm looking at it in general, yung mga carrier proteins naman nila, I don't expect it to cause that much of an effect. But if you have allergies, halimbawa to eggs, this is the reason why they ask about if you have allergies to eggs, then they will usually mas lalong tututukan nila kayo. Hindi yung parang automatically contraindicated, no? Because again, yung mga adverse reactions as a result of severe allergic reaction is still very low in the population, but less than 1%. So basically what I'm trying to say is it is expected that there might be some people who have mild allergic reactions, but we're talking about on the level of nangangate, nagkakaroon ng fever, which that can also be an allergic reaction to that, or tenderness at the site, mga ganon. But otherwise, the only true contraindications to certain vaccinations is if you are immunocompromised, or if you've come recently from another illness. Yun yung mga usual ways that, or you have severe disease. So halimbawa yung talagang ICU ka na, there's no point in giving you the vaccine if you're hospitalized for a severe condition. So there are sets of criteria that doctors have for when it's appropriate to give a vaccine. But otherwise, I think in terms of yung mga side effects, people have to be aware that it is possible and they are monitored. And if you have any allergies nga to any known allergens or something, we are just more tututukan namin kayo for the occurrence of any side effects and whether or not it might progress. But just so you know, sa mga existing vaccines, anaphylactic or yung mga severe allergic reaction responses are usually less than 1%.
Salamat, Doc Ayes. Follow-up na rin. Ano raw, may mga pag-aaral na ba sa long-term effects ng vaccine para sa buntis at sa sanggol? At kasunod dito ay mayroong tanong, I am an ovarian cancer survivor for 6 years now, and I am 66 years old. Is it safe for me to be vaccinated? So yung
Okay.
isa sa mga sanggol at buntis at yung isa naman.
Okay. So
cancer
long term,
survivor.
I mean, just putting it into context, the vaccine isn't even a year old yet. So yeah, we definitely do not have any long-term data on those populations. But for now, usually it's better first to see it in the main population. So yung mga buntis at yung mga sanggol, they fall under the protected populations, which is why in order to protect them, there has to be herd immunity to sila yung papalibot sa kanila para protektahan sila. And the same goes for other populations na contraindicated they can't receive the vaccine. Now, it will depend din kasi early phase trials are being done clinically for those groups. And it will take a while before the manufacturers are able to release more information on that. Right now kasi I can't make an estimate, but for example, yung mga traditional vaccines that have a regular development schedule of around 8 years. Usually, these trials occur alongside the rollout. So, kapag rolled out na yung vaccine, usually the clinical trials in these special groups have already undergone some preclinical evaluation for at least 3 or 4 years. So it usually runs in parallel. Ganon sila. So I wouldn't be surprised if later this year, maybe in the latter half of the year, we might receive some updates on the kung pwede o hindi na ibigay sa mga groups na to. Now, yung sa ovarian cancer survivor, first, congratulations. No, that's great. And yes, it should be safe. I don't see any reason why just because you come from cancer, it would be contraindicated. in general, your risk is the same as any other individual, stratified based on age. So of course, risks of getting infected are always go up as you grow older. But there is no association naman with severity of vaccine side effects with age. Just to be clear. So ibig sabihin, if you look at yung mga population na nagkakaroon ng adverse event or yung mga side effects dun sa vaccines, walang nakikitang correlation with age. So it's very sporadic, kanya-kanya, which points more to an immune system thing. No, it's more an individual thing on the level of their immune system that causes or makes them more susceptible to having a side effect. Wala siyang kinalaman sa age. Doc Dulce, nakamute pa kayo. Yan.
Okay, next question. Are the currently rolled out vaccines effective versus the new variants? 1. Tapos during the ongoing biosequencing, can you also monitor other variants aside from the UK one? And then yung third, elaborate on the term chronically infected in the context of yung probable cause of mutations in the virus. I'm just confused since we know that the patients are already treated after the 14-day quarantine. Does this mean that the virus is still transmissible after 14 days?
Okay, let's break it up. So the first one was, is the current vaccine effective? Ang sagot, based dun sa, again, we look at the mutation and the place on the spike protein involved. And so far, based dun sa in silico studies from the vaccine developers, yes, it is effective. It should not, or rather the better way of saying it is, it should not be enough to cause the vaccine to no longer have its reputed efficacy in the population. That said, kasi remember what I said about how antibodies work. Minsan nagkakaroon din ng slight variations in the antibodies which allows it to seek out yung mga kamuka even if it's not exactly that variant. That said, as the virus continues to spread and as nagkakaroon ng mas maraming variant at palayo yung hugis because of the number of variants, that's when you start realizing na baka mamaya it won't be as effective, which goes into the next question about variant surveillance. That's the reason why we're doing the variant surveillance kasi hahanapin namin yung mga variants na identified dun sa studies that are known to have antibody escape. I pointed out the one in the Brazilian variant, for example, has shown some reason to be concerned with the efficacy of vaccines with its ability to neutralize this specific variant with this type of mutation. And that's the reason why yung biosurveillance is key. Now, I didn't allude to this yet, pero what does that mean in terms of vaccines? The other nice thing about mRNA tsaka yung mga adenovirus vaccines is that it's easier to tweak. No? Kasi since it's mRNA-based, iibahin mo lang naman yung sequence at ipasok mo na lang doon sa tao. So it's actually faster to create updates, quote-unquote, doon sa vaccine kaysa mga purified protein derivative kasi magsa-start ka from scratch tapos dadamihan mo ulit yung protein doon sa laboratory with the bacteria. So that's the other benefit of the mRNA-based vaccines. And I'm actually anticipating na once we've sorted out the logistics and most people have been vaccinated, they can start creating yung mga single vial preparations which will simplify the rollout of the vaccines. Again, we're looking more on the safety, yung logistical feasibility and yung rollout. And the last one was the chronic infection. Okay. I avoided, iniwasan ko na medyo i-complicate yan. But this was populations of people who are in the ICU. When you say chronically infected, ibig sabihin protracted yung kanilang yung kanilang COVID-19. No? Most people, healthy individuals, kapag kayo ay nahawa ng COVID-19, You have symptoms within 5 to 7 days. You're usually infectious for another 5 to 7 days, and then the virus starts waning. So the total duration of illness is usually 10 to 14 days. Yan yung normal, or not normal, but the average person. Yan, that's what they experience. No? Yung mga chronic infected mentioned here, these are special populations of people who have immune disorders na the reason, and because of that, or they're elderly and because of that they have affected immune systems, kung kaya yung infection nila lasts much longer than the 14 days. Yung mga ito, usually they're in the ICU for months, no? Sa tagal, and on their own life support. And because of problems in their immune system, hindi agad-agad nasugpuan yung virus. So the virus still continues to replicate inside their body. So you can think of it as, and this is just their hypothesis. We're not saying na ito yung talagang dahilan. But this is what they believe is how this happened. Is dahil sa UK, maraming mas matanda. And a lot of them are also on other chronic medications that can affect the immune system. Sa tagal nila sa ICU and the virus was not totally eradicated, it mutated within their own bodies. So again, remember how mutations occur. It's the adaptation ng virus sa mga attacks against it. So you can imagine na yung kapag hindi siya totally na-annihilate, parang kinakalaban mo yung rebelde, tapos gumagawa ka ng tactic, natututo siya, ay, ito yung estilo nila, gawin natin ganito. So they change. And then it becomes an evolutionary arms race inside your own body. So that's the theory that they have kung bakit yung UK variant na to has more mutations than expected. But again, what I would like to remind you is based dun sa mutations na nakita namin sa UK variant, it does not look like it is enough to cause yung current vaccines to be less effective, or at least to impact yung efficacy ng rollout and herd immunity that we can get from the current vaccines. The bigger issue is with the mutation that was found in the Brazilian, which is what we're looking at right now. Kasi siya mismo yung medyo hindi na kasing kumakapit yung antibodies that are been identified to be produced from yung current vaccines natin. So that's just so you understand yung context ng yung pinakita kong slide na yan, yung theory nila where the UK variant came from. In fact, tingin ko dapat hindi ko pinakita yan kasi that was from the Ateneo lecture. Medyo complex yung slide na yan. But it's good you brought it up para ma-explain ko ng
Salamat. Meron pa, marami pa tayong questions, Doc Ayes, ha? Yung kasunod, considering what you explained on the concern of efficacy, would you say that it is more recommended to get the Sinopharm vaccine once available than not get vaccinated at all, since the main apprehension on that vaccine is the efficacy and side effects? What would be the pros and cons? Thank you. And then related to that, should I consult my doctor as to the brand of vaccine I should get? There are studies that certain vaccines are suited for Asians, elderly, etc.
Okay, so yun sa first part, whether or not you should go with Sino, regardless of what vaccine it was, if there is a vaccine that is available and it is given to you, please take it. It should not even be an issue of what the vaccine is or where it came from. Again, and that's why I'm stressing about yung sinasabi na efficacy. No, these vaccines have been developed and designed with the molecular structure of yung virus in mind, and they have passed the minimum threshold necessary in order to induce an immune response that can impact the herd immunity of a population. Yun yung that's the bottom line there. So regardless of if it's Sinovac, kasi I am not promoting any one vaccine over the other. In my opinion, they are all great vaccines. Okay, credit has to be given where it's due. Kasi yung mga vaccine na to, it usually takes years. 4 years ang pinakamabilis. This one is done in less than a year, and they did it in a manner that was safe. No, so it's either that, or if you want the true yung aantayin nyo talagang yung whatever it is you're trying to go for na efficacy, but you risk it becomes a balancing act. Na will you risk further infection and mutation of the virus in the population, thus rendering your vaccines ineffective, or you receive the vaccine now, and if there are any updates required like a booster shot, necessary down the road, at least you were able to reduce the number of infections and of course the number of deaths. Again, the reason why I'm talking about this, and I don't expect everyone to look at it this way. Kasi ako as a doctor, tinitingnan ko from the public health perspective. And syempre, ang worry ko is the herd immunity. It is the immunity of everyone in general. And it's understandable na as an individual, kasi ako yung tuturukan eh. So syempre, sariling kapakanan ng anuhin ko. I get that. I understand that. But what I'm trying to impress upon you is these vaccines are still good, regardless of where they are. So if it's available, I would recommend you tanggapin nyo na. Huwag na kayo mag-antay ng mga iba. Kasi as you continue without being vaccinated, you are increasing the risk not only for yourself but for other people of getting infected. Now, yung with regard dun sa yung sinasabing there are some vaccines that are with some population, I would recommend that you take that you look at those with some amount of critical analysis because of this one requires a lot of yung you need to be able to critically appraise yung mga reports na yan because they're quite small population. I'm not saying that's not possible. It might be possible, but it's not enough information to create a general recommendation is what I'm saying. No. So even though may mga preliminary findings that may suggest that certain vaccines might be better for certain populations, it is not enough evidence to recommend that a vaccine should be proportioned to a certain population over others. Sa ngayon po, the priority is to get the vaccine to as many people as possible. Intindihin ninyo po, there are many strategies and there is no single correct one. But if the main goal po is to prevent additional deaths and infections, then I would say that availing of a vaccine that is safe and proven to be effective in clinical trials, regardless of its relative efficacy dun sa mga ibang vaccines out there, then please get that vaccine. Because right now, again, ang pangunahing goal is to prevent additional infections and further mutation of the virus in the population.
Next question. It has been said that all vaccines contain mercury and other toxic substances. How true is this? And if it is true, then would vaccines not be really dangerous?
Okay. We'll have to start very basic. That myth came about when someone found out that there is a preservative in vaccines called thimerosal. And when you look at the molecular structure of thimerosal, it has an atom of mercury in it. No. But please understand that mercury in its structure is not the same as the mercury that you find in your thermometers. Actually, bawal dapat, wala ka na dapat mercury sa thermometer. Pero yung mga mercury that you see, that you know causes disease, no, that's different. We're talking about on the level of chemistry. I don't want to go too deep into it, but the molecular properties of an atom when it is part of a molecule is very different than its elemental properties. However, we can't avoid people saying, hala, may mercury, patay na, ano siya. No. But, and to make things worse, in order to appease the vaccine denialists, manufacturers decided to replace thimerosal with a different with a different preservative that no longer has that atom in it, which I believe caused more harm than good. Kasi parang pinapalabas nila, ay, tinanggal nyo naman pala eh. But just so you understand where this myth is coming from, it's this misunderstanding that a certain preservative, which is, and the preservative is important kasi some people have been asking me, ba't palagyan ng preservative? If you don't have the preservative, the vaccine will not be able to survive transport and you wouldn't be able to store it. Again, remember, vaccines, in order for them to be effective as a whole, okay? I'm not just talking about the vaccine preventing the disease on the talking about the whole. Kasi you have to remember vaccination as an entire strategy. You have to be able to get that vaccine to the places it needs to be. It's a very complex dance of sorts of logistics. And that's why you have that preservative in there kasi kailangan niyang mag-survive yung transport kasi ginagawa yan sa ibang bansa eh. Tapos i-ship dito under cold conditions. Tapos kapag stinor sa ref, minsan nilalabas-pasok, labas-pasok yan eh. yung mga ibang vaccines. So you need to have those preservatives because again, if the vaccine's quality is compromised because of handling, it's not going to be effective. Yun. So that's just the background there. Itong mercury, I will say it right now, it is a myth. It has been debunked, but people keep on bringing it up because they refuse to understand or listen to the experts. Now, when we're saying that that's hindi, kasi they have their own agenda. Okay, so ano yung second part ng question?
Nasagot na ninyo.
Okay.
Doc Ayes. Ang susunod ay, do asymptomatic COVID cases still develop antibodies?
Yes. Ang ibig lang naman sabihin kasi ng asymptomatic is that you just didn't develop symptoms, but you still got infected, and any infection resolves with an immunity. So for example, if you have diba you've heard of the rapid antibody test, right? A rapid antibody test, I think kung nandito kayo sa dati kong talk, sinasabi ko, ginagamit namin po ito para upang makita kung kayo po ay na-infect dati. That's what it means. Kasi ang minimeasure doon is the antibody. So kapag kayo po ay wala namang kayong hindi nyo you don't remember na na-infect kayo, pero nag-rapid antibody kayo, tapos nag-positive, ang ibig sabihin doon is you had it in the past, no? So you didn't have symptoms, but we detected antibodies. So that means you were infected, you just didn't have any symptoms. Same thing with dengue. Kasi dengue uses the same idea. Kung nakapunta kayo sa hospital, nag-dengue antibody test sila, tapos sabi, you had dengue in the past. Hindi ko naalala, wala akong naalala. Same thing. So you have antibodies to the virus. That means you were infected at some point in the past. So yes, if you're asymptomatic, and proven that you had a positive test, tinest kayo positive, and then we do an antibody test and you have antibodies, that means you have antibodies.
So, may dalawang tanong. Anong klaseng mga tao po ang mga hindi dapat mag-take agad ng vaccine?
Okay.
Ano po ang mangyayari if a person takes 2 or more vaccine brands or types?
Okay, that's maganda yung second question. But for the first one, again, gaya ng sabi ko kanina, there are certain groups that we do not give vaccines to. Yung mga young populations and pregnant na kasi there's wala pang safety information regarding that, so we don't give to them. We also don't give to immunocompromised, yung mga kumukuha ng gamot na nagpapababa ng immune system dahil sa sakit nila. We also don't give to people who are undergoing chemotherapy. And we also don't give to people who have severe disease. Halimbawa, naka-admit kayo sa ICU for whatever reason, no? Because the chance and this is a combination of things. It's not only the reason for the contraindication isn't just because it's not because it's not safe. Okay, just to be clear, sa children and pregnant, the reason why we don't give it is because wala pang safety profile. That's why you don't give it. Pero yung mga kulang sa immunity, may undergoing chemotherapy, the reason we don't give it is because there's a risk that it won't be effective. So that's actually one of the other contraindications, kasi we do not give a vaccine that has a low chance of providing immunity. Because number one, para siyang nagbibigay ng gamot na alam mo hindi namang walang bisa. That's not good in medicine. First, do no harm kami. Tsaka the second reason is it might give a false sense of security to those individuals. And you don't want that. You don't want people engaging in activities that increases their risk when you gave them something that is likely not to provide them the protection that they need. So that's the reason why we have those contraindications. Bukod pa dun sa mga known possible complications or risk of complications. Kasi again, sabi ko sa inyo, the occurrence of side effects or adverse events is sporadic. It's hard. There is no clear association of any severe event to any specific pre-existing condition. Except for, halimbawa, if it's a live attenuated virus. And I didn't talk about this anymore kasi wala naman tayong live attenuated viruses na binibigay sa COVID-19. Pero halimbawa, yung chickenpox, yung binibigay sa chickenpox, that's live attenuated. Kaya hindi po namin binibigay yan sa mga taong ka-infect lang or yung mga what do you call this?
yung mga may immune problems with immunity. Kasi when you say live attenuated, weakened siya, di ba? Weakened virus. So if you give a live attenuated to someone na mababa yung immune system response nila, there's a chance they will get infected. Kasi weak yung immune system mo, binigyan mo ng weak virus, edi parang ano lang sila, patag. It's the same. So that's one of the main contraindications na alam namin talaga magkakaroon ng side effect if you give that type of ano. But again, I trust that your doctors know about the appropriateness of certain vaccines in certain populations and when best to give a vaccine. Now, sa second one, magandang question yan about are there any risks about giving more vaccine at once? There is no such thing as a vaccine overdose. Okay? If you've ever noticed na sometimes when you, halimbawa, hindi kayo madalas pumunta sa doktor, no? Tapos, this is a very common experience. Pupunta kayo sa ER kasi nasugatan kayo. No? Halimbawa, nasabit yung paan nyo sa gate or something, tapos nahiwa. Gano'n. Punta kayo sa ER. Ano tatanungin nila sa'yo? Nakatanggap na ba kayo ng tetanus shot? Hindi nyo naalala. Pero parang naalala mo na naturukan ka dati, pero hindi mo alam. Sasabihin nila, was it less than 5 years ago? Siyempre, hindi mo alam, di ba? Parang, pero hindi ka sure. What do? We still give you tetanus toxoid. Why? It is safer to give it than not to give it. Because there's no such thing as a vaccine overdose. Kung meron ka ng antibodies, as binigyan ka namin ng vaccine, edi wala lang. Magkakaroon ka ng additional antibodies. There's nothing wrong with that. Or the vaccine therefore acts like a booster. That's the idea. Kesa naman na hindi namin ibibigay, i-assume namin na you had one recently and run the risk na baka you'll have the complications of tetanus. So the dictum for us sa vaccines in general, wala namang overdose kasi it's based sa immune response ninyo. Pero kapag hindi kami sure kung nakatanggap kayo ng vaccine dati, we give another vaccine kasi there's no such thing as an overdose. Hindi porket na nakakuha ka ng vaccine dati, hindi ka sure kung meron ka ngayon, tinanong ka ngayon, you can still receive another vaccine. There's no problem with that.
Doc Ayes, meron lang lumabas na parang listahan ng mga health conditions na tinatanong ang ating audience. Babanggitin ko lang sila isa-isa, pero baka meron ka na lang general na sagot.
Yes, it is
So
general.
ito, kidney disease, liver disease, heart disease, skin asthma, bronchial asthma, G6PD, hypertension, diabetes, tapos yung mga nagbe-breastfeed. How safe is the vaccine for those people with these underlying conditions?
Okay. When you talk about conditions, pre-existing conditions, just para maintindihan nyo gaano ka-complex ang science. If you wanted to figure out the effect of a vaccine in a population with that specific you'd need to test lots of people with that condition and make sure wala kang mga confounding variables and things. Kasi pansinin nyo, each of those one has their own inherent risks, right? Which may or may not be related to its reaction with the virus, but may just be because of the result of your condition. And hindi po lahat ng may kidney disease ay magkapareho. Hindi rin po lahat ng may kidney disease ay meron din silang heart disease. Meron din mga ibang may heart disease at G6PD. So you can imagine all these different combinations. I cannot account for all of the combinations at once. But what I can say is there should be no reason to assume that a pre-existing condition should affect the vaccine efficacy unless it has a direct effect on your immunity. That's the reason why ang binanggit ko lang are those individuals who have cancer undergoing chemotherapy na yung immune system nila is deliberately lower because as a result of the medications, or mga people who have autoimmune disorders. Basta yung mga sakit na involving the immune system, dun kami medyo may reservations with regard to the efficacy of the vaccine. Now, as for all the other ones, the impact of a side effect on your pre-existing condition is highly dependent on you. That's why we cannot account for all possible variations ang gusto kong sabihin. Which is why if, for example, kayo po ay marami mga comorbidities na and you will receive the vaccine, it is imperative sa doktor na if-follow up kayo and tututukan nila kayo such that if anything happens as a result, halimbawa the side effects, kasi the side effects might be more pronounced sa'yo. Kasi halimbawa may COPD nga kayo. Or because of the fever, tumaas yung heart rate ninyo. So kapag may heart disease kayo, baka mas nararamdaman ninyo. But that does not mean that it is not safe. It just means that there needs to be additional monitoring kasi these are expected side effects. I know it's difficult kasi I'm giving a lot of information at natatakot kayo, but there is also an amount of trust. Kasi again, if you look at it on the flip side, kung kayo po ay maraming mga comorbidities and mas lalo yung dapat iniisip na ma-vaccine kayo. Kasi kapag hindi kayo na-vaccinate at nagkasakit kayo ng COVID, mas mataas ang chance na mamamatay kayo. That is known. I know that for a fact and the studies have shown that. So you have to look at it in terms of risk assessment. Okay. Again, I notice people are kind of losing the focus eh. Kasi, ay, marami akong sakit. So kapag na-vaccinate ako, ang lala ng side effect. But the same applies if you don't get vaccinated and you get infected, mas mataas ang chance nyo mamatay. Don't forget those things. Okay? So again, it's about how I cannot assure you 100% walang risk sa pagkuha ng vaccine. That's clear, ha? There may be cases na magkaroon ng side effects. Expected yan. Kung kaya importante na mag-coordinate and to always follow up with your doctor so that we can document and we can give you reassurance kung sakali magkaroon kayo ng side effects. Okay? This is the first time in history for most people to undergo a mass worldwide vaccination strategy. The last time nangyari yung ganito was polio in the 60s. So karamihan ng mga tao ngayon are either too young to remember that or too old. So I'm not surprised na medyo naninibago ulit ang mga tao and these concerns are coming up. And it's good. It's good na lumalabas yung mga concerns nito kasi it's something that we need to address para mas kampante kayo when you receive the vaccine.
So Doc Ayes, eto meron ding related questions. Una, is it advisable to do swab test first before being vaccinated? Tapos merong nagtatanong din, kapag ba nag-positive, kailangan pa rin ba na magpa-vaccinate?
Okay. So regarding needing to test before for vaccine, not needed anymore. It's not necessary. Although if you have symptoms, it's best to first clarify that you don't have the disease. Kasi in general, and this goes for any disease that we're vaccinating for, we cannot give the vaccine while the person is currently ongoing infection. Number one, kasi nangyari na yung sakit. And second, even if it's not, halimbawa, let's say you got influenza, right? So nagkatrangkaso kayo. I can't give you the COVID vaccine kasi yung immune system mo is busy fighting the flu. So kumbaga, distracted na siya. So kapag binigyan kita ng vaccine na sa ibang sakit, madidistract siya. Hindi ganun ka-efficient yung pagbuo. So most likely your immunity will be insufficient to COVID. So it's more harmful kasi mahahawa ka pa rin and then you might be So that's why if you're wondering bakit sinasabihan kami mag-flu vaccine, that's the reason. No? Kasi if you don't get your flu vaccine, it might and you get trangkaso, it might delay your ability to get the COVID-19 vaccine. And again, ang current strategy worldwide is to get as many people as vaccinated as possible because it will lower infection and also lower the chance of it mutating. And in effect, lower the worldwide death caused by the disease. Okay. Now, ano ulit yung isang tanong?
Yung kung nag-positive
okay.
yung tao, kailangan pa bang mag-vaccinate?
Yeah. There are still some there are different guidelines that are being developed. Also because right now it's still being inaaral pa rin nila kung totoo ba nagkakaroon ng reinfection kung tawagin, no? Medyo this is complex. I don't want to get too much into it kasi there are several factors regarding bakit dalawang beses mag-positive ang isang tao. But assuming resources are present, I would recommend everyone, even if you've been diagnosed in the past, to also get the vaccine. However, take note na the vaccines are being rolled out in a priority manner, meaning we have to focus first on the high-risk groups. And as a result, yung mga previously infected will fall under the lower risk or lower priority groups. No? But that's not to say that's the only determinant. So for example, kasi case to case, I just want to make it clear na lahat ng sinasabi ko is based on risk assessment. I've noticed a lot of people are always, looking for specific guidelines na dapat ganito, ganyan, ganyan, ganyan. The reality is a lot of things are based on risk, and we have to evaluate case-to-case basis. So for example, let's say you've already been previously infected kasi healthcare worker kayo, right? So na ano kayo? You are still required to take the vaccine because of the high risk of exposure. So those are certain populations, and it will depend. Now, ako personally, I think that even if you've been infected in the past, because it's not yet sure regarding the status of repeat infection, might as well get the vaccine. However, chances are baka less priority kayo depending on your situation. Yun ang gusto kong iparating sa inyo po.
Thanks, Doc Ayes. Meron tayong natitirang mga 4 na tanong. So tatapusin na lang natin yon, and then we'll close the forum. Meron dito, minsan po ay mahirap magbigay ng tiwala. Like vaccines were given to older people, 60 and above. Then news came out that vaccine will not be given muna to them because of the incident. So vaccine will be given to younger ones. So confusing. Any comment on this, Doc?
Well, itong the statement was this a different country again? Yung nag-stop muna sa matanda. This is Indonesia, if I'm not mistaken, no? Yeah, Indonesia. It's hard for me to comment on decisions made with regard yung mga ganon. But again, I will defer to what you call risk assessment. Okay, so the consensus in the community is that we're still investigating these incidents of death and you also have to look at it in terms of political dimensions, no? And that's something kami mga scientists wala namang talaga kami magawa diyan. Kasi sa totoo lang, and sometimes we're blamed of being medyo kalos, no? Kasi if you look at the number of deaths, they're very small compared to the total population that was vaccinated. It just so happens, and the problem with us scientists, kapag nakakita kami ng mga numbers na yan, we have to make sure we're not missing anything. Now we don't jump to conclusions. Kaya magalit kayo sa amin na medyo mabagal kami to come to conclusions because we're very careful, because decisions have implications. But that being said, those who are in positions of responsibility to dictate policy have to be answerable to a wider population, right? So I don't blame certain countries if they go with certain strategies to appeal to people, which makes sense because you have to be but I understand also it causes confusion. So the only comment that I have there is, kami on our side, we still have to investigate these cases. But regardless of what strategies are employed, we adjust them based on the risk assessment that has been made. So for example, if Indonesia decides to wag muna ibigay sa matatanda because they feel that it is more prudent to hold off muna while we're still investigating yung cause of death sa matatanda, that just changes the risk assessment. Now, since this population cannot be vaccinated, how do we protect them? Again, there is no one single correct approach. It is culturally based. It is based on your culture, your societal setup, your socioeconomic setup of the country. So all countries will have different approaches on how to do it. So it's very difficult to look to a different country. Bakit ganun ang ginagawa nila? Bakit tayo hindi? There are many factors that have to be put into play. So ang hinihingi ko lang sana po is some patience at pag-uunawa din po sa nabubuong mga estratehiya. And again, it's based on risk assessment. If you're wondering bakit parang paiba-iba yung approaches ng mga countries. And again, I think I keep on reiterating it. There's no single correct way. There are multiple ways of doing it. But regardless of how you do it, it has to be anchored in science. It has to make sense. It has to be based on evidence. Hindi pwede yung kasi gusto mo ganito, ganyan, ganyan. And yun nga, dun sa example sa Indonesia, I believe that is their reasoning behind it. Because they want to be more careful kasi mas mataas ang risk assessment nila. But that being said, it has its own challenges dun sa rollout strategy nila. Since they decided not to give to that population, they're going to have to find other strategies to provide herd immunity dun sa mga hindi nila munang i-vaccinate. Decision lang po nila yan based sa risk assessment nila. They're not willing, kumbaga, they're not willing to take the risk habang hindi pa sila sure dun sa conclusion kung ano ba nangyari dun sa mga na-identify. Now, you might argue maybe we should do the same here or maybe not. Again, it depends on the risk assessment and yung evaluation ng appropriateness of such a strategy in our setting in the Philippines.
Thank you. Last three. Some patients who recovered from COVID had short-lived neutralizing antibodies. Could you elaborate on this, please? And how does this impact the effectivity of the vaccine in individuals and in the community?
Okay. Ang ibig sabihin ng short-lived neutralizing antibodies, that exists in several, in different diseases as well. Ibig sabihin, yung antibody, yung nag-neutralize dun sa virus, hindi tumatagal sa katawan na gawin. Now, you'll notice there are some diseases that will require boosters. Narinig niyo yan, di ba? Yung parang naka-booster shot ka na ba? So for example, measles, binibigay ng bata, but they receive a booster during their school year, usually at 1 year and then usually at 9 years of age. And from the studies done on that, which is studies based on a long period of time, they determined that those booster schedules ang kailangan to create what is called robust, persistent immunity. Ibig sabihin, you're immune for life. No? Kasi the reality with a lot of these antibodies is some persist for a while, some will wane over time. It's not fully understood kasi how long per individual. So it's ano kasi siya eh. It's per individual nga eh. Some like halimbawa ako, nung pumasok ako sa medisina, lahat kami kailangan matest ng antibodies for Hepa B. No? Pero lahat naman ng mga bata kasama sa immunization yung Hep B. Pero iba sa mga kasama ko, kami, we receive boosters regardless. Pero eventually, nung pumasok na kami sa residencia doon sa hospital, so that's 5 years later, nung nagpa-retest ng Hepa B, kasi na-booster na kami nung med school, nung tinesting kami ng Hep B ulit, yung iba, wala na masyadong antibodies, kailangan ng booster. Tapos yung iba sa amin, okay pa rin ang booster. That's what it means. You're talking about persistence. And the persistence of immunity, it becomes more important sa mga ganitong klaseng diseases which are highly infectious and highly transmissible. Kasi you want prolonged immunity para ma-limit yung pag-spread. Unfortunately, this is the cold. It's the common cold, di ba? So the tendency is, as an RNA virus, I'm not surprised na yung immunity derived from it is very short-lived. Does that mean that parang magiging siyang flu? Will it be similar to the flu na every year kukuha kami ng vaccine para lang magkaroon ng antibodies to fight it? Honestly, I don't know. Which is why yung vaccine strategies that we're going to do now and hopefully throughout the world, nakikita din as more and more people are vaccinated, the profile of how the virus responds to the vaccine. Kakailanganin ba ng booster every year? Or baka may immunity na nakukuha for a certain amount of years and then afterwards there might be a booster. We don't know. Kasi remember, we've only been experiencing this virus for less than a year. Information na nakukuha namin sa mga viruses, the vaccine strategies that we have for viruses like smallpox, chickenpox, polio, this is over decades of experience. So may konting we ask for a little patience and understanding as more and more information comes out regarding paano nga ba yung pinaka-effective vaccination strategy and how would it look like in the future. Pero as far as yung immediate right now, I can say that the vaccines are reasonably effective to provide immunity to the population for the current strain. And it is an important step kailangan gawin upang mababa yung infections, and by doing so, we can limit the amount of mutations and variants that can come about. Kasi kapag dumami yung mutations, mas mahihirapan tayo sa vaccine. Again, it's a tug of war siya. So parang kapag hindi na vaccinate, mag-mutate. So kailangan ng bagong vaccine, ganun. Tapos mag-mutate, ganun. So but we are learning more and more as time goes on. So ayun.
Last two questions.
Mm.
Babasahin ko na siya ng magkasabay o magkasunod.
Mm-mm.
Can you comment on the decision in some countries to distribute the first dose to as many as possible instead of giving the complete 2 doses to as many as possible? Does it
Magpatama sa
dilute
US.
efficacy? And then yung panghuling tanong ay, could you also please emphasize the significance of strengthening immunity as an approach in disease prevention?
Okay. So first, lakas magpatama sa US. Okay. And I can't comment, of course, on their strategies or what they were thinking. But in terms of, again, I'll go back to what I always said about the importance of vaccine strategies. Efficacy is only one part of the puzzle. The other part is the rollout to ensure that it works. So obviously, kung iisipin ninyo, kapag meron kayong binigay sa inyong bagay at ganito ang instruction ng paggamit, sundin nyo. Right? So it's yeah, I mean, I don't want to get into any political discussion, but let's just say that the initial rollout occurred during a time in America's governance where a certain person was in power and things happened. So yeah, but in an ideal world, yes, you're right. Kapag binigay yung first dose, you have to assure that they will get the second dose because that will ensure the efficacy as seen in the clinical trials. No, that's not to say that you won't get immunity with just 1 dose out of 2, but the likelihood is much lower because there's no evidence to suggest that it can based on the studies. Now, Dr. Anthony Fauci actually already mentioned this in one of his latest statements last week. Now, in terms of prioritization, because of the way that the vaccine were initially rolled out, one of the priority groups is to give to those who have already received their first dose. Kasi hindi pwedeng nakabitin yung mga taong naka-first dose, wala palang second dose. So in an ideal world, dapat yes, if the vaccine calls for 2 doses, you need to get both doses in order to ensure the efficacy of the vaccine. Now, dun sa kabila, the role of immunity as part of a preventive approach. In general, yes, that's
Strengthening
true.
immunity.
Strengthening immunity. What do you mean by strengthening? Okay, so your immune system either works or it doesn't, right? You'll notice that there are certain activities that will actually make you more susceptible to getting infected than others. However, unfortunately, the coronavirus is what we call a novel coronavirus. Bago siya. It's never been, hindi pa siya natagpuan sa tao until now, no? And because of that, it is very difficult to develop any form of a natural immunity. Ibig sabihin, kusa kang hindi ka ma-infect ng regardless of how healthy you may be, no? Unfortunately. However, what encouraging good lifestyle and habits that would strengthen your immune system, what that does do is it gives you a better chance if in terms of kapag na-contract mo, mas likely na hindi ka magkakaroon ng severe disease. Or kung magkaroon ka man ng severe disease, mas likely na you'll be able to survive it. Yun ang importance ng having a robust immune system. Which is why if you look at those deaths associated with COVID-19, yung karamihan dyan, yung mga groups that have a lot of existing comorbidities or yung mga with issues to access to adequate healthcare. So medyo multidimensional kasi. But when you say yung mga may comorbidities, karamihan yung mga existing conditions kasi yun nga, yung halimbawa, if you have kidney disease, edi pinatungan mo pa ng isa pang infection. So mas lalong ipupush yung kidney, the chances of you failing are much higher. And then yung access to medication, kung kayo ay galing sa mahihirap na lugar and you don't have access to intensive care, kung sakaling kayo po ay naging severe, then the chances of you dying because you don't have access to such advanced care is also higher. So yan yung mga And the other effects, of course, of yung mga deaths is the overloading. And I think this is something I should probably underscore. One of the other reasons why we really want to emphasize the importance of getting immunized para bumaba yung mga kaso is also to relieve the strain sa healthcare system. Kasi yung isa pang contributor sa death is the redirection of resources to those with ano. So yung mga taong kinakailangan din ng medical care that not necessarily related sa COVID-19 ay naaapektuhan na rin din sila. So we probably don't hear a lot about it sa news kasi hindi masyadong nire-report. Although if you do look at yung mga DOH bulletins, they do report actually yung hospital occupancy. And just to give you context, I think the latest was around 70 or 70 something percent, something like that, which is actually okay. But when you compare it to hospital occupancy on like normal, when in a non-pandemic, it's around 50 to 60. That translates to hundreds of thousands of beds. So you can imagine how much of a burden yung ano to is sa mga ano. And take note ha, kawawa din kami mga doktor kasi yung may iba sa amin nagshi-shift ng matagalan. Pero okay lang sa amin yan. Ha? Pero that doesn't mean na patagalan natin tong pandemic na go fight. Hindi. If we can lessen the burden on our healthcare workers and staff, the sooner we can lower the numbers, mas mainam. It will also help yung sa mga ibang diseases, no? Kasi mas naaalagaan nila yung mga ibang may sakit kaysa naman na puro COVID. So yun.
Maraming salamat, Doc Ayes. Meron pang ibang mga tanong pero ang gagawin namin siguro, ipopost namin ang sagot ni Doc Ayes sa FB page ng UP Diliman para mabasa ninyo. I-acknowledge din natin na marami tayong mga nakasama ngayon na galing sa ibang eskwelahan na nakikinig mula sa Bulacan, Pangasinan, Cavite, Muntinlupa, Zambales. At maraming natutuwa, Doc Ayes, na napaka simple at madaling maintindihan ng inyong mga paliwanag. Kaya rin naman ang sabi, so babasahin ko lang yung isa. Thank you very much, Dr. Ayes. You are a very good speaker, very knowledgeable, and a very good teacher. So thanks much. So at ito ngayon, ang huling tanong sa inyo. Bukas ba ang tanggapan ni Dr. Ayes na maanyayahan sa mga pag-uusap ng mga komunidad tungkol sa COVID-19 at vaccines? Napakalinaw at ang mga pagpapaliwanag. So ito, sa mga komunidad ito, meron talagang pangangailangan na magbigay ng impormasyon sa ating mga kasama sa komunidad. So kakilala ko naman yung nagtanong, so pwede na akong gumanap na manager ninyo, Doc Ayes, at ibigay sa kanya ang inyong contact details kung gustuhin ninyong pumunta sa komunidad.
Kasama naman po talaga sa mission ng PGC is to inform and to enlighten people with regard to yung mga topics na kagaya ng mga ganito. So of course po, I have been more than happy to share yung mga knowledge para din po sa kaalaman ng mga iba.
Okay. So salamat. Meron ding tanong dito kung mabuview daw ba ulit ang webinar na ito. Isi-save ho natin ito sa sa FB page ng UP Diliman, at para sa mga kawani, faculty, etc., pwede rin ho namin ipadala yung link ng Zoom para mapanood ninyo. So sa bandang ito, siguro kasama kasi natin ang dalawa nating doktor mula sa University Health Service. Baka lamang meron silang gustong ibahagi, lalo na ang UHS natin ang nagsasagawa ng ating mga pagbabakuna. So nandito si Dr. Aliza ng Public Health Unit natin, at nandito rin si Dr. Jessica Taboy na siyang namamahala ng ating mass testing at ng Silungang Molave sa UP. So maaari ko bang tawagan si Dr. Aliza Pangaiba para lamang magbigay ng ilang mga paalala?
Naririnig po, ma'am. Hello,
naririnig.
magandang tanghali po sa lahat. Una-una maraming salamat po kay Dr. Ayes sa pag-share niya po ng kanyang expertise, lalo na to sa issue ng variants, mutation at vaccination. Sana po nakatulong ito sa inyong lahat upang mas maintindihan. Tandaan po sana natin lahat na vaccine save lives. So kung i-offer po ito sa atin, ang importante nating tandaan ay kung ang bakuna na ito ay may tamang approval, ligtas, gaya ng nabanggit ni Sir, at kung ito ay bumabase rin naman sa mga clinical trials na talagang nagpapakita na ito ay epektibo para maiwasan natin na magkaroon po tayo ng malubhang karamdaman na COVID-19. Lagi rin po nating tandaan na dapat po makinig po tayo sa mga experts opinion. Kasi po maraming lumalabas po talaga ng mga fake news, no, na nakakapagpababa ng confidence ng ilan sa ating mga kasamahan sa vaccine. So, tandaan po natin, maging vigilant po tayo sa mga fake news na ito. At huling-huli, siguro, i-emphasize ko lang na ang vaccine ang ating pag-asa sa pandemic na ito sa ngayon. Marami pong salamat.
Doktora Pangaibat,
Apo.
pwede lang nating ibigay sa kanila ang information tungkol sa schedule ng flu shots natin.
Flu shots, ma'am?
Oo, flu shots.
Yung flu, yung flu na dati
Yung
natin
regular,
ma'am?
oo.
Yung regular, ma'am. Sa ngayon is for this year, wala pa pong nalalabas na bagong strain, ma'am, for the flu.
Wala pa. Okay.
Wala pa yung bagong strain. Opo, kasi yearly po yung sa flu shot.
Okay. So, sige, magbibigay na lang tayo ng updated na information later. Okay, ho. Sige. Salamat, Doktora Alisa. At tawagan ko si Doktora Kataboy.
Opo. Unang-una, congratulations kay Dr. Ayes. Talagang napaka-informative ng kanyang lecture, and I'm sure it will do a lot of good in convincing people to undergo the vaccination. I am really honored to have him as a colleague. Ang pangalawa naman po ay wag sana po natin kalimutan yung ibang measures, no, para maiwasan ang COVID-19, yung patuloy na paggamit ng facial mask, yung physical distancing, yun pong hand washing, respiratory and cough hygiene, avoiding crowds, and ensuring good ventilation. With that, sana po mawala na itong COVID-19 na sakit. Maraming salamat.
Salamat po, Doktora Kataboy. Siguro panghuli lang na paalala sa mga kasama sa UP Diliman. Patuloy pa rin ho yung pag-schedule natin ng ating mass testing. So kung hindi pa ho kayo nakapagbigay ng inyong mga CIFs, maaari hong mag-submit kay na Doktora Alisa Pangaibat at kay Doktora Kataboy para ma-schedule na kayo. Meron tayo sinasagawa natin yung mass testing hanggang mid-February. So meron pa tayong panahon. So sana ay ini-encourage namin ang lahat na magpa-test. With that, maraming salamat ulit at kay Dr. Edsel Ayes, kay Chancellor Fidel Memenzo, kay Dr. Alisa at kay Dr. Jessie. So maraming salamat po sa lahat ng umattend. Salamat din sa mga miyembro ng task force na nandito ngayon at sumama sa atin. Sige. So ayun na lamang at hanggang sa susunod na forum ng UP Diliman.
Thank you.
Doc Ayes, congratulations.
Thank you po.
Maganda.
Ay, kapagod.
Kailangan lang nating sagutin talaga